Welcome to Sheriff Files. Please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. Cold settles different in the hollows than anywhere else I've known. It seeps up from the ground rather than falling from the sky, like the earth itself is exhaling winter through ancient lungs. That's how it was the night Ellie Mercer vanished, a peculiar cold that seemed to watch you back. I still dream about those woods. 27 years wearing this star, and not a single case has followed me into retirement quite like that one. The file sits unmarked in the bottom drawer of the station's archives now. Missing person E. Mercer unresolved. I know because I check on it whenever I visit Sheriff Daniels, who took my place when arthritis finally made my trigger finger too unreliable. The call came just after sunset on November 12, 1997. I remember because the hunter's moon hung low and swollen in the sky that night, casting everything in a sickly amber glow. The station phone had that particular ring it gets when someone's barely holding themselves together on the other end. Martha, who'd been dispatching calls since before I pinned on my badge, didn't even have to tell me it was serious. "Jim Mercer's girl hasn't come home," she said, her voice tight with the effort of remaining professional. "Says she went mushroom picking in the afternoon. Should have been back before dark." In a town like Black River Creek, we didn't get many missing persons. Everybody knew everybody's business, their habits, their schedules. Children walked to school alone. Doors remained unlocked. The worst crimes I typically dealt with were the occasional drunk driver or domestic dispute. But something about Martha's voice made my skin prickle. "Whereabouts was she headed?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. "The hollow behind their property. You know the area, where the old Campbell place used to stand before the fire?" I did know it. Locals called it Stillwater Hollow, a depression in the land where mist gathered so thick some mornings you'd swear you could scoop it with a spoon. The remnants of the Campbell house, just a stone foundation and chimney now, had been slowly returning to the earth for 30 years. Kids dared each other to spend nights there. Teenagers used it for drinking and other activities best not discussed in polite company. But it wasn't a place most adults ventured, especially not after the sun went down. The Mercer property backed up to the eastern edge of Stillwater Hollow. Their modest farmhouse sat on 15 acres, most of it untamed woods sloping down into that misty basin. Jim Mercer met me at the end of his gravel drive, a flashlight clutched in one white-knuckled hand. I knew him casually. He worked maintenance at the high school, fixed the occasional small engine around town. A quiet man, not given to dramatics. "She knows better than to stay out after dark," he said without preamble, his voice hoarse. "Ellie's a sensible girl, Sheriff. 17 years old and never given me a minute's trouble." I nodded, climbing out of my cruiser. The dome light caught his face, hollow-eyed, pale as cemetery marble. "When's the last time you saw her?" "Around 2. Said she wanted to gather some hen of the woods mushrooms. Been a wet autumn, and she knows where they grow. Takes after her mother that way, God rest her." He swallowed hard. "She had her basket and that red jacket of hers. Said she'd be back to help with supper." The wind picked up then, carrying with it the scent of lonely earth and decaying leaves. And something else, something metallic that reminded me of the inside of old, abandoned buildings. I turned toward the woods, where the trees stood like sentinels guarding the entrance to the hollow. "You checked the usual spots?" I asked, though I knew he had. Jim nodded. "Walked our whole property line calling for her. Even went down into the hollow a ways, but it gets dark fast down there." His voice dropped. "And I don't much like that place after sundown." I motioned to my deputy, Rogers, who'd followed in his own vehicle. "Let's organize a proper search." I'll radio in for volunteers. Within the hour, we had 15 men with flashlights spread out in a search line, moving methodically through the woods toward the hollow. The beams of light cut through the darkness like probing fingers, illuminating patches of underbrush, the occasional startled eyes of nocturnal creatures, but no sign of a 17-year-old girl in a red jacket. The forest that night seemed attentive. I've spent my life in these woods, hunting, fishing, tracking the occasional lost hiker, but I'd never felt them watching back before. The usual night sounds, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals, were oddly muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The farther we moved into the hollow, the more pronounced this silence became. The ground grew soggy underfoot. The hollow collected water, never quite drying out even in the hottest months. Now, in November, each step produced a subtle sucking sound as boots pulled free from the muck. The smell of decomposing vegetation hung thick in the air, occasionally overwhelmed by a sharper odor, something acrid that burned the nostrils slightly. "Ellie!" Voices called out at irregular intervals, each shout swallowed quickly by the dense woods. The sound didn't carry as it should have. It was as if the air itself absorbed our calls rather than transmitting them. We reached the old Campbell Foundation around midnight. Moonlight filtered through the bare tree branches, casting the crumbling stonework in stark relief. The rectangular outline of what once was a cellar gaped like an open grave, half filled with decades of fallen leaves and debris. "Spread out," I ordered. "Check every inch." As the men moved away from me, their flashlight beams dancing erratically through the trees, I approached the foundation. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, though I told myself it was just the dropping temperature. November nights in the mountains can cut to the bone. The chimney still stood, a solitary monument to what had once been a home. I ran my flashlight along its length, noting how the stones seemed almost to absorb the light rather than reflect it. At its base, something caught my eye, a glint of color against the uniform gray of the rock and brown of the earth. I moved closer, my boots squelching in the soft ground. There, partially obscured by a clump of pale fungus growing at the chimney's base, was a small woven basket. My heart sank as I recognized it as the type someone might carry to collect mushrooms. "Over here!" I called, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the dense air. Rogers was the first to reach me. "That hers?" he asked, breath fogging in the cold. "Could be." I crouched down, my aging knees protesting. The basket was empty, tipped onto its side as if hastily discarded. The handle was damp with dew, but otherwise it looked recently placed. No signs of animal disturbance or weathering. "No footprints," Rogers observed, sweeping his light across the ground around the foundation. He was right. The soft earth should have held impressions, but the ground was unmarked save for our own tracks leading up to the spot. Jim Mercer pushed through the gathered men, his face crumpling when he saw the basket. "That's Ellie's," he confirmed, voice breaking. "Her grandmother made it." I stood slowly, my mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. "All right," I said, taking control of the situation before panic could set in. "We found something of hers, which means we're on the right track. Let's expand the search radius." "She might have..." A sound interrupted me. Not loud, but so out of place that every man there froze. A girl's laughter, light and musical, coming from nowhere. Everywhere. It echoed around us as if bouncing off invisible walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. "Ellie?" Jim called, voice raw with hope and fear. The laughter faded, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against the eardrums. Then the wind picked up suddenly, violent and cold, whipping through the trees with enough force to send dead leaves swirling around us in miniature cyclones. My flashlight flickered, then died. Around me, Other lights began failing as well, plunging us into darkness relieved only by the sickly moonlight filtering through the canopy. "What the hell?" someone muttered. "Everyone stay calm," I ordered, though my own heart was hammering against my ribs. I slapped my flashlight against my palm, a useless gesture that nonetheless produced a weak beam that illuminated the ground at my feet. And that's when I saw it, a footprint. Small, like a woman's or teenage girl's, pressed into the mud where moments before there had been none. As I stared, another appeared beside it, as if someone invisible were walking away from the foundation. "There," I said, pointing. The men looked but seemed unable to see what was right before their eyes. Rogers shook his head. "What am I looking at, Sheriff?" "The footprints," I insisted. "Right there." But their faces remained blank, confused. Only Jim seemed to understand, his eyes widening as another print appeared, and another. "Follow me," I said, moving quickly to keep pace with the appearing footprints. They led away from the Campbell Foundation, deeper into the hollow where the trees grew so close together their branches intertwined like gnarled fingers overhead. The air grew colder with each step, that strange bottom-up cold that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ground became increasingly soggy, then marshy. The footprints I followed began to fill with water almost as soon as they appeared. Behind me, I could hear the confused voices of the search party, but they seemed to be growing more distant despite the fact that I wasn't moving particularly fast. The weak beam of my flashlight caught on something ahead, a flicker of red among the monotonous brown and gray of the November forest. "Ellie?" I called, quickening my pace. The red disappeared around a massive oak tree whose trunk was wider than my outstretched arms could reach. I followed, rounding the tree and finding myself in a small clearing I'd never seen before, despite having hunted these woods my entire life. In the center stood a pond, perfectly circular, and so still its surface might have been black glass. No ripples disturbed its perfect smoothness, not even when the wind gusted. Around its perimeter grew mushrooms, hundreds of them, pale and luminous in the moonlight, arranged in a perfect circle. A fairy ring, my grandmother would have called it. A place where the veil between worlds grows thin. Standing at the edge of the water was a figure in a red jacket, back turned to me, dark hair hanging loose down her slender back. "Ellie?" I called again, relief flooding through me. "Your father's worried sick." The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me in any way. I took another step forward, and the ground beneath my boot made an odd sound, not the squelch of mud, but something hollower, like stepping on a rotted board that gives slightly underweight. "Ellie Mercer," I said, using my sheriff's voice now, the one that expected compliance. "I need you to come with me, girl." Slowly she turned. The moon caught her face, and my breath caught in my throat. It was Ellie. Her features were exactly as I remembered them from seeing her around town, but her eyes were wrong. They reflected the moonlight like an animal's would, glowing faintly in the darkness. Her skin was pale, too pale, with a bluish undertone that spoke of hypothermia or worse. "Sheriff Sullivan," she said, her voice containing that same echoing quality we'd heard before, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "You shouldn't have followed me. Your daddy's looking for you," I said, taking another cautious step forward. The ground felt spongier here, unstable. "Everyone is. Let's get you home where it's warm." She smiled then, a gentle expression that somehow chilled me more than anything else I'd experienced that night. "I can't go back," she said simply. "I belong to the Hollow now." "What do you mean?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. "Nobody belongs to a piece of land, Ellie." Her head tilted slightly, like a curious bird's. "The Campbell house didn't burn by accident," she said, the non sequitur catching me off guard. "They knew what was underneath." They tried to seal it shut. A prickling sensation crawled up my spine. The Campbell House fire had happened before Ellie was born. How would she know anything about it? What's underneath, Ellie? I found myself asking, though a part of me screamed not to engage with this line of conversation. She gestured toward the pond. See for yourself. Against my better judgment, I approached the water's edge, careful to avoid the mushrooms that formed their perfect circle. The surface of the pond was so still it acted as a mirror, reflecting the moon and stars with perfect clarity. But as I leaned over to look, I realized I cast no reflection at all. Instead, where my reflection should have been, I saw straight through the water as if it were a window rather than a surface. Below was not mud or pond weeds, but what appeared to be a room with wooden floors and wallpapered walls. A room that might once have been the cellar of a house like the Campbells. Movement caught my eye, shapes moving in that submerged room, human-like but distorted, elongated in a way that made my mind want to skitter away from fully processing what I was seeing. They moved in a slow, swaying dance, reaching upward toward the water's surface, toward me. I jerked back, nearly losing my balance. What is this? I demanded, turning to Ellie. But she was no longer alone. Standing beside her now were others, perhaps a dozen figures of various heights, all with that same otherworldly pallor, all with eyes that reflected the moonlight like animals. Some wore clothing that might have been fashionable decades ago. One, an elderly man in overalls, I recognized with a jolt as Old Man Campbell himself, who had supposedly perished in the fire that claimed his home. The hollow claims who it wants, Ellie said, her voice still eerily calm. Sometimes it just wants company. Sometimes it needs tending. Tending to what? My mouth was dry as dust. The door, replied a woman standing near Ellie, her dress style at least 50 years out of date. It needs to stay closed, except when it needs to be fed. The ground beneath my feet shifted then, not like mud giving way, but like something solid suddenly becoming less so. I looked down and saw with horror that the earth around my boots was dissolving, revealing glimpses of wooden floorboards beneath. I stumbled backward, away from the pond, away from Ellie and her impossible companions. My heel caught on something, a tree root or rock, and I fell hard onto my back, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. As I lay there, gasping, the world around me seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The trees, the pond, Ellie and the others, all of it wavered and distorted. For one terrible moment, I wasn't in a forest at all, but in a large room with high ceilings and walls that seemed to breathe. Then it snapped back, and I was lying on my back in the damp earth of Stillwater Hollow, alone. No pond. No mushroom ring. No Ellie. Sheriff! Roger's voice came crashing through the trees, followed by the man himself, flashlights swinging wildly. Jesus, we've been looking everywhere for you. You just took off into the woods without a word. I sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in my back. What are you talking about? I was following the footprints. I told everyone to follow me. Rogers looked at me like I'd grown a second head. What footprints? You just suddenly ran off. Been gone nearly 40 minutes. That couldn't be right. I'd only been speaking with Ellie for a few minutes at most. I struggled to my feet, looking around at the utterly ordinary section of forest where I found myself. No sign of the massive oak, the circular pond, or any of what I'd just experienced. Did you find her? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Rogers shook his head. Nothing yet. Jim's beside himself. We're going to have to call in reinforcements at first light. I nodded, trying to collect my scattered thoughts. Let's head back to the foundation, regroup from there. As we walked, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Had I fallen and hit my head? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and the strange atmosphere of the hollow? But it had felt so real. Ellie's voice, the cold rising from the ground, the sight of what lay beneath the pond's surface. When we reached the Campbell Foundation again, the search party had expanded. More volunteers had arrived from town, and someone had brought thermoses of coffee and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. The night had taken on the organized chaos of a proper search operation. Jim Mercer sat on a fallen log, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hands. I approached him slowly, dreading the conversation I needed to have. "Jim," I said quietly, sitting beside him, "I need to ask you something, and it might sound strange." He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Anything, Sheriff. Anything that helps find my girl." "The Campbell House fire," I began carefully. "What do you know about it?" He frowned, clearly confused by the question. "Same as everyone, I guess. Electrical fault, they said. Place went up like tinder. Old man Campbell died inside. Nothing unusual about it." Jim hesitated, then shrugged. "Well, there were rumors, of course. Small town like this always has rumors." "What kind of rumors?" I pressed. He glanced around, as if afraid of being overheard. "Some said Campbell had been digging in his cellar. Found something he shouldn't have. Some said he was trying to seal something in when the fire started." He shook his head. "Just nonsense people make up after tragedy." "Why? What's this got to do with Ellie?" I couldn't tell him what I'd seen. He'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I wasn't taking his daughter's disappearance seriously. "Just following a hunch," I said instead. "Sometimes old stories contain kernels of truth." The search continued through the night and into the following days. We brought in dogs, volunteers from neighboring counties, even a helicopter from the state police. But Ellie Mercer was never found, not a scrap of clothing, not a single strand of hair. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. In the official report, I wrote what was expected: teenager lost in woods, presumed deceased from exposure or injury, body unrecoverable due to difficult terrain and wildlife activity. But in my personal journal, locked away in my desk drawer at home, I recorded what I really saw that night in Stillwater Hollow. Over the years, I returned to the hollow many times, always alone. I never again found the circular pond or saw Ellie and her strange companions. But sometimes, when the conditions were just right, usually on cold, clear nights when the moon was full, I would hear laughter echoing among the trees. And occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of red moving through the underbrush, always just at the edge of my vision, gone when I turned to look directly. Jim Mercer never recovered from his daughter's disappearance. He died 5 years later. Heart attack, they said, though those of us who knew him understood he died of grief long before his heart finally gave out. The strangest part came just last year, when developers purchased the land containing Stillwater Hollow, planning to build vacation cabins. During the initial survey, their equipment kept malfunctioning near the Campbell Foundation. When they brought in ground-penetrating radar, they discovered something unusual. What appeared to be a room beneath the old cellar, a room that shouldn't exist according to any existing plans of the house. Before they could investigate further, 3 of their workers fell ill with an undiagnosable condition: high fever, confusion, and a peculiar form of selective amnesia where they couldn't recall anything about their time working in the hollow. The development company abruptly withdrew their plans, citing environmental concerns as their official reason for abandoning the project. The land remains untouched to this day. I'm an old man now, my sheriff days long behind me. But sometimes on nights when I can't sleep, when the wind has that particular hollow sound as it moves through the trees around my cabin, I find myself thinking about Ellie Mercer and what she said to me in the hollow. It needs to stay closed, except when it needs to be fed. I wonder what lies beneath Stillwater Hollow. I wonder if it's still closed. And most of all, I wonder when it will hunger again. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep, I think I hear laughter, a young girl's laughter, musical and light. And in those moments, I keep my eyes firmly shut, afraid of what I might see if I were to open them. A pale face with moonlight reflecting in its eyes, come to tell me that it's my turn to belong to the hollow. The fog came first, before anything else that night. Not the usual mist that clings to creek beds or hovers over the lake in autumn. This was something different. It rolled in thick and purposeful, like it was searching for something, swallowing the pines that rimmed Cold Hollow until you couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. I remember standing on my porch that evening, coffee gone cold in my hand, watching as it devoured the landscape. The air felt wrong, heavy with moisture but somehow thin in the lungs, carrying a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. That was 3 hours before Ellen Kirby called about her missing boy. The county I serve isn't on many maps. We're tucked away in the shadow of mountains that tourists drive past on their way to somewhere else. Most nights, my job involves breaking up the occasional bar fight or checking on Old Man Wilson when he forgets to pick up his heart medication. But there are other nights, the ones that stay with you long after the badge comes off. Nights like the one 17 years ago, when the Kirby boy vanished. I still hear the static crackle of the dispatch radio sometimes when I try to sleep. Marlene's voice coming through, steadier than it should have been given the circumstances. "Sheriff, we've got Ellen Kirby on the line. Her boy Tommy hasn't come home. Been gone since sundown. Kids go missing sometimes. They lose track of time fishing, or fall asleep in tree houses, or run off to a friend's house without telling anyone." But something in Marlene's voice told me this wasn't that kind of missing. I grabbed my hat and keys, the wooden floorboards of my old house groaning beneath my boots as I headed out into that unnatural fog. The Kirby place sits at the edge of town where the paved road surrenders to gravel. It's a tired-looking farmhouse that's needed a fresh coat of paint since before Tommy was born. That night, every light inside blazed against the darkness, as if electricity could somehow burn away worry. Ellen met me at the door, her face pale and drawn tight across her cheekbones. Her fingers worked restlessly at the hem of her cardigan, twisting the worn fabric. "He knows better than to be out after dark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He knows what's in those woods." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what she meant by that last part. Cold Hollow Woods had its share of bears and the occasional mountain lion, but nothing a smart 14-year-old boy couldn't avoid. "When did you last see him?" I asked, my notepad already out, though I doubted I'd need to write anything down. In a town this small, every detail sticks. "After dinner. Said he was going to check his rabbit snares before dark. That was at 6. He's never late. Never." I glanced at my watch. 10:47 p.m. "What was he wearing?" "Red flannel jacket. Blue jeans. Those hiking boots I got him for his birthday." Her eyes drifted toward the coat rack by the door, where a flashlight hung from a nail. "He didn't take his light." That detail settled in my gut like a stone. No kid goes into those woods at dusk without a light. Not even to check snares 30 yards from home. "I'll find him," I promised, the words out of my mouth before I could consider their weight. Ellen just nodded, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls of that kitchen. Outside, the fog had grown even thicker, so dense it seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight. The air had turned colder, too, with a biting chill that cut right through my sheriff's jacket. November in these parts isn't gentle, but this cold felt different, sharper, more deliberate. I started at the edge of the Kirby property where a worn path disappeared into the tree line. The trees stood like sentinels, their bare branches reaching upward, black fingers against the murky sky. My boots sank into the damp earth, each step producing a soft, sucking sound. "Tommy!" I called, my voice strangely muffled in the fog. "Tommy Kirby!" Only the soft patter of moisture dripping from the branches answered. I followed the narrow path deeper into the woods, sweeping my flashlight in wide arcs. The beam caught the silvery threads of spider webs strung between trees, glistening with dew. Something small scurried through the underbrush to my right, probably a raccoon or a possum disturbed by my presence. About a quarter-mile in, I found the first snare, empty, reset. 20 yards beyond that, another, also undisturbed. Tommy had been here, had checked these traps, but had continued onward. I pressed ahead, following what I hoped were his tracks in the soft soil. The path gradually narrowed until it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. The trees grew closer together here, their trunks covered in pale green lichen that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The silence deepened, no insects chirping, no night birds calling, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. Just the sound of my own breathing and the dull thud of my heartbeat in my ears. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, straining to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the forest itself were drumming out a signal. My flashlight beam darted from tree to tree, catching nothing but bark and fog. "Tommy?" I called again, my voice sounding thin and insignificant. The tapping stopped. For 3 long heartbeats, there was absolute silence. Then, from somewhere ahead came a sound I still hear in my nightmares, a low, keening moan that rose steadily in pitch until it was almost a scream, before abruptly cutting off. Every instinct told me to turn back, to return to the safety of my truck with its reassuring police radio and reliable engine. But there was a boy out here somewhere. So I pressed on, one reluctant step after another. The ground began to slope downward, and I realized I was heading toward the old quarry, a deep pit where they used to mine limestone decades ago. It had filled with water years before I became sheriff, creating a small, unnaturally blue lake that locals avoided. Too deep, they said. Too cold. Things get lost in there. As I neared the quarry's edge, the fog thinned slightly, allowing the waning moon to cast a pale glow over the scene. The water lay perfectly still, a black mirror reflecting the night sky. And there, at the water's edge, was a splash of red, Tommy's flannel jacket, neatly folded on a flat rock. Next to it sat his boots, placed side by side, as if awaiting his return. I approached slowly, my flashlight trained on that lonely pile of clothing. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding the rock, no sign of struggle, nothing to indicate how the boy had reached this spot. It was as if he had simply materialized there, removed his outer clothing, and what? Gone for a midnight swim in the quarry's frigid depths. "Tommy!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the water's surface. "Tommy Kirby!" The quarry remained silent, indifferent to my growing panic. I reached for the radio on my belt, intending to call for backup, when something caught my eye, a ripple in the center of the quarry, spreading outward in concentric circles. I trained my flashlight on the spot, but the beam couldn't penetrate the inky blackness of the water. Another ripple followed, then another. Something was moving beneath the surface. I inched closer to the water's edge, my boots sinking into the cold mud. The ripples continued, moving closer to shore. A fish, I told myself. Or a turtle. Anything but what my mind was beginning to fear. Then the surface broke, and something emerged. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like a hand, 5 pale fingers reaching upward from the water, but too long, too thin to be human. It hung there for a moment, water streaming from its skeletal form, before slowly submerging again. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. My heel caught on a root, and I fell hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. My flashlight flew from my grasp, rolling to a stop with its beam pointing toward the sky. As I lay there, struggling to breathe, I became aware of a sound coming from the water. A wet, rattling breath, followed by another. Something was emerging from the quarry. I scrambled for my flashlight, my fingers closing around it just as a figure rose from the water. Not Tommy, not anything I could readily identify. It stood at the quarry's edge, water cascading from its form, its outline blurred by fog and darkness. For a moment, it seemed to stare directly at me, though I couldn't make out any features that resembled eyes. Then it turned and moved along the shore, its gait uneven and lurching, leaving no footprints in the mud. I should have pursued it. I should have demanded answers about the boy. Instead, I remained frozen, watching as it disappeared into the tree line, the fog swallowing it whole. Minutes passed before I could bring myself to move. My legs trembled as I approached the rock where Tommy's jacket and boots remained. I reached for the radio again, this time managing to call for additional deputies and a search team. Then I noticed something I had missed before, a small spiral notebook tucked into the pocket of the flannel jacket. With shaking hands, I opened it, angling my flashlight to illuminate the pages. Most were blank, but on the final page was a childish drawing of the quarry. In the center of the water was a crude figure, long-limbed and pale, its arms reaching upward toward a small human form poised at the water's edge. Beneath the drawing, in Tommy's careful handwriting, were the words, "It calls me when the fog comes." The search for Tommy Kirby lasted 3 weeks. We dragged the quarry, brought in tracking dogs from the county over, combed every inch of those woods. We found nothing, no body, no blood, no sign of where he had gone or what had happened to him. Eventually, the case file gathered dust on my desk, then in a cabinet, then in the archives of our small sheriff's station. Life in Cold Hollow drifted back to its normal rhythm. Ellen Kirby moved away the following spring. The fog came and went with the seasons. But I never went back to that quarry, and I never forgot what I saw that night. Then, last month, 16 years after Tommy disappeared, a hiker found something tangled in the roots of a fallen tree near the quarry. A red flannel jacket, child-sized, the fabric rotted by years of exposure. It was identical to the one I had found neatly folded on that rock all those years ago, right down to the brass buttons and patched left elbow. The jacket I had logged into evidence. The jacket that should have been sealed in a box in our storage room. I drove out there myself, stood at the edge of that dark water for the first time in 16 years. The quarry was as still and silent as I remembered, revealing nothing of its secrets. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into a nearby tree trunk. Fresh cuts in the bark, the raw wood still losing sap. 5 vertical lines, arranged like fingers reaching upward. And below them, 2 words that turned my blood to ice. Still calling. That night, I sat on my porch long after sunset, staring into the darkness beyond my yard. I thought about retiring, about finally turning in my badge and leaving this town and its secrets behind. Just as these thoughts were taking shape, a familiar scent filled the air, metallic, unnatural, and in the distance, a thin veil of fog began to form, creeping over the pines toward Cold Hollow. I went inside and locked my doors, but I know better than most. Locks mean nothing when the fog comes calling, carrying voices only some can hear. And sometimes, on the stillest nights, I think I can hear it too, the soft tap-tap-tap of something patient, something hungry, waiting for me to answer. It's been 24 hours since that fog rolled in. This morning, Ellen Kirby's grandson was reported missing. 14 years old, just like his uncle was. Last seen heading toward the woods to check his rabbit snares. I'm too old for this job now. My hands shake when I hold my flashlight, and my knees protest every step on uneven ground. But I've called in the state police and the county search teams. They'll be here by nightfall. As for me, I'm sitting in my truck at the edge of cold hollow woods, watching the afternoon sun sink lower in the sky. The fog is already gathering between the trees, earlier than usual. My flashlight is on the seat beside me, along with my service weapon. I'm not sure either will be of use where I'm going. But I made a promise to find that boy 17 years ago. Perhaps tonight, I finally will. The fog is thickening. It's time. The taxidermy crow in evidence locker 13 never gathered dust. 43 years wearing this badge, 31 as sheriff of Coleridge County, and I still check on that damn bird every morning before I pour my coffee. Not because regulations require it, nobody but me even remembers it's there, but because sometimes, in the murky half-light before the fluorescents fully flicker on, I swear those glass eyes track my movement. I've never told anyone this story in full. Parts of it exist in official reports, fragmented across different departments, but the complete picture? That's been locked up tighter than the evidence it concerns. But I'm retiring next month, and some burden shouldn't go to the grave unspoken. It started with a house call out to the old Blackwood property in '97. That sprawling Victorian nobody wanted to buy after Marjorie Blackwood passed. The place sat empty nearly 7 years until some fancy art dealer from the city purchased it for what locals considered pennies. Callum Ward was his name. I remember thinking it odd how eagerly he took the property despite its reputation. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in June. Nothing dramatic about it. Clear blue sky, cicadas buzzing, temperature pleasant enough. Dispatch said Mr. Ward reported unusual disturbances in his home. The way Linda at Dispatch described it, I figured it for typical city folk jitters after moving somewhere where true darkness and silence still exist. I took my time driving out there. The Blackwood house stood alone at the end of Whispering Pine Road, that winding stretch that follows Miller's Creek before cutting through the eastern woods. As I pulled up the gravel drive, something felt peculiar. Not wrong, exactly, but like the air had a different weight to it. Ward answered the door immediately, as if he'd been waiting by it. He was a tall, gaunt man with perfectly manicured hands and clothes that cost more than my monthly salary. "Sheriff Barrett, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm but quick, withdrawn like he didn't want contact for too long. "Please come in." The interior of the Blackwood house had been transformed. Gone were the dated furnishings and musty wallpaper I remembered from Marjorie's estate sale. In their place stood stark white walls adorned with abstract paintings and sculptures I couldn't make sense of. Modern furniture, all clean lines and uncomfortable angles, populated the space. But what caught my attention were the mirrors. Dozens of them, different sizes and frames, arranged in careful patterns on nearly every wall. "You mentioned disturbances, Mr. Ward?" I asked, unable to stop my eyes from darting between my many reflections. "Yes," he said, leading me through the foyer and into what had once been the parlor. "It began 3 nights ago. I was cataloging new acquisitions when I heard what sounded like scratching from inside the walls." I nodded. "Old house like this, could be any number of critters. Raccoons, squirrels. It's not animals," he cut in, voice sharp. "The sounds have patterns. Sometimes it's scratching, other times tapping. 3 quick, 3 slow, 3 quick again. And they follow me from room to room." I made a note in my pad. "Anything else?" "The mirrors. Ward gestured to an ornate antique mirror hanging above the fireplace. "I've found them, rearranged. I placed them carefully, Sheriff. Each one has a specific position, angle, and purpose. But I wait to find them shifted by fractions of an inch." "You live alone, Mr. Ward?" "Entirely." He swept his hand dismissively. "No cleaning service, no visitors. Just me and my collection." I walked closer to the mirror he'd indicated. Old thing, probably mid-1800s, with a gold leaf frame darkened by age, carved with intricate figures that, upon closer inspection, formed a continuous scene of what appeared to be a hunt. "This is an unusual piece," I remarked. "Flemish, early 19th century. One of 13 identical mirrors commissioned by the Van Houten family. I've spent 20 years acquiring them." Something cold crawled up my spine. "You have all 13? He smiled then, the first genuine expression I'd seen on his face. 12. I have 12. The 13th has proven elusive." I remember how his voice changed when he said that word. Elusive. Like he was savoring it. "Well, Mr. Ward, I can arrange for Deputy Collins to check your crawlspaces for animal intrusion. As for the mirrors," I shrugged. "Old houses settle. Floorboards shift. Could be creating the illusion of movement." Ward's smile faded. "Sheriff, I don't believe in illusions. I deal in physical objects and their provenance. Something is happening in this house, and I suspect it has to do with local history I'm not privy to." I maintained my professional demeanor, but internally alarm bells were ringing. Most newcomers took years to even hint at Coleridge's darker history, if they ever discovered it at all. "What makes you say that?" I asked carefully. He walked to a small side table and picked up a yellow newspaper clipping. This was tucked behind one of the mirrors when I removed it to hang. An article about Marjorie Blackwood's great-aunt, Adelaide. I didn't need to see the clipping. Everyone in Coleridge knew about Adelaide Blackwood and the winter of 1887. The official story was that she'd succumbed to consumption. The whispered truth was darker. Adelaide had quite the collection of mirrors herself, didn't she, Sheriff? Ward was watching me closely now. "I wouldn't know," I lied. "That was before my time." Ward replaced the clipping. "I'm not concerned with ghost stories, Sheriff. I'm concerned with whoever is entering my home and disturbing my property. I want regular patrols past my house and a serious investigation into who might harbor ill will toward me." I assured him we'd increase patrols and asked him to call immediately if the disturbances continued or escalated. As I turned to leave, something made me pause at the parlor doorway. "Mr. Ward, those mirrors of yours, the Van Houten set, what makes them so special you'd spend 20 years collecting them?" He straightened a small silver-framed mirror on the wall before answering. "Legend has it they were created to contain something. The Van Houtens believed reflections weren't just images but doorways. The craftsmen who made these mirrors supposedly incorporated materials and methods to reinforce the barrier between what's reflected and what's real." "And you believe that?" I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. "I believe in their historical and monetary value, Sheriff. The legend merely adds to their provenance." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Though I admit I find it interesting that the 13th mirror was last documented in the possession of Adelaide Blackwood." I left the Blackwood house with a growing unease. Ward was too interested in things better left forgotten, asking questions nobody in Coleridge had asked in generations. On the drive back to the station, I detoured to visit Margaret Holloway at the County Historical Society. Margaret was in her 80s then, a walking encyclopedia of Coleridge history, both the sanitized version for tourists and the real stories passed down through families like hers and mine. "Callum Ward?" she repeated when I asked if he'd been by. Yes, spent nearly 3 days going through our archives last month. Particularly interested in the Blackwood family and their connection to the Van Houten mirrors. What did you tell him? I asked, accepting the cup of tea she pressed into my hands. Margaret's ancient eyes narrowed. Only what's in the public record. That Adelaide Blackwood purchased a mirror at auction in 1886, supposedly one of a set commissioned by a Belgian family. That she hung it in her bedroom. That after her death, the mirror was nowhere to be found. I nodded, relieved she'd kept to the official version. Did he ask about the other mirrors? He already knew about them. Showed me photographs of the 12 he's collected. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. Robert, he has the black obsidian one. The one that's supposed to be the key. My stomach dropped. The obsidian mirror was part of the story my grandfather had told me, the part that never made it into any written account. Is it genuine? I asked. Appears to be. Belgian maker's mark, correct dimensions, the obsidian backing instead of silver glass. She set her cup down with a soft clink. He knows more than he's letting on, Robert. He asked about the cave system under Miller's Creek. I thanked Margaret and left, my mind racing. The call about disturbances now seemed like a pretense, Ward's way of getting me out there to gauge what I knew. I contemplated what to do next when my radio crackled. Sheriff? We've got another call from the Blackwood house. Mr. Ward says someone's inside. Linda's voice carried an edge of concern. I hit the lights and made it back to Whispering Pine Road in record time. The house looked undisturbed from the outside. No broken windows, doors still locked. Ward met me on the porch, visibly agitated. In the basement, he said without preamble. I heard footsteps and voices. I drew my sidearm. Stay here. The basement door was located off the kitchen, a heavy oak affair with an antique iron latch. It swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, recently maintained, I noted. The stone steps leading down were clean, no dust or cobwebs. The basement itself was a surprise. Unlike the modernized upper floors, this space remained largely untouched. Stone walls, dirt floor in some areas, plank flooring in others. The only light came from a few bare bulbs hanging from ancient wiring. And mirrors. 7 of the Van Houten collection hung at precise intervals around the room, creating a perfect circle. In the center stood a wooden pedestal holding what had to be the obsidian mirror, not reflective like the others but a deep, light-swallowing black. I asked you to wait upstairs, Mr. Ward, I said without turning, sensing his presence behind me. Did I say something was down here now, Sheriff? His voice had changed, all pretense of concerned homeowner gone. I said I heard someone. Past tense. I turned slowly. Ward stood at the foot of the stairs, blocking the exit, a small, curious smile playing at his lips. What exactly are you doing here, Mr. Ward? Finishing what Adelaide Blackwood started. He moved further into the room, toward the circle of mirrors. She found a way to break through, you know. Not just to see beyond the reflection, but to reach through. The problem was control. She couldn't control what came back. My hand tightened on my weapon. I think we should continue this conversation upstairs. Ward ignored me, running his fingers lovingly over the obsidian mirror's frame. The Van Houtens created these mirrors as a set for a reason. 12 to form the circle, the 13th, this one, to open the door. But Adelaide only had the one. She tried to substitute 12 ordinary mirrors and well, he chuckled. We both know what happened to her. I did know. The official record said consumption. My grandfather told me how they'd found her, or what was left of her. Her fingers worn to bone from scratching at the mirror's surface, her eyes, not her own anymore. The 13th mirror wasn't lost. I said, the truth finally clicking into place. It was hidden. Deliberately. By your family, if I'm not mistaken. The Barretts have been sheriffs in Coleridge for generations? Ward's smile widened. Amazing what you can learn in small-town archives. Buried in incident reports, property transfers, last wills and testaments. Your great-grandfather was the one who responded to the Blackwood house that night. I said nothing, mind racing through possibilities. The evidence locker. The records. What my father had told me about family obligations. Where is it, Sheriff Barrett? Where did your great-grandfather hide the 13th mirror? Ward's voice had taken on an almost hypnotic cadence. You're trespassing on dangerous ground, Mr. Ward. I raised my weapon. Step away from the mirrors. Now. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and dark. A taxidermy crow, no bigger than my hand, its glass eyes catching the dim light. Found this in Adelaide's journal. The sympathetic connection. The eyes that see both sides. My blood ran cold. The crow in evidence locker 13. The one that never gathered dust. The mirrors are doors, Sheriff. But they need eyes to see through, a vessel ready to receive. He placed the bird atop the obsidian mirror. The air in the basement changed instantly, became dense, charged like the moment before lightning strikes. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Ward, stop! I shouted, moving forward. Too late. He sliced his palm with a small blade and pressed the bleeding hand against the obsidian surface. The blood didn't smear or drip. It disappeared into the black as if sucked through. The other mirrors began to vibrate. Subtle at first, then violently enough that their frames rattled against the stone walls. In their reflections I saw movement. Not our reflections, but shadowy figures pressing against the glass from the other side. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Step away from the mirror! Ward looked at me, eyes fever bright. They're coming through. After all this time, they're finally. The obsidian mirror shattered. Not cracked or broke. Exploded outward with such force that Ward was thrown backward, shards of black glass embedding in his face and chest. Something moved in the space where the mirror had been, a darkness deeper than absence of light, a void with texture and weight. It poured from the broken frame like smoke but moved with purpose. I fired twice more, the bullets passing harmlessly through the darkness. Ward wasn't so lucky. The shadow enveloped him, and his screams. God, his screams. I still hear them sometimes. What happened next remains fragmented in my memory. I remember running, the basement door slamming shut behind me with such force it cracked down the middle. I remember the house groaning, windows shattering inward. I remember making it to my cruiser just as every mirror in the house exploded simultaneously. The official report states that Callum Ward died in a house fire caused by faulty wiring in the basement. That the body was too badly burned for an open casket funeral. That the case was closed within a week. What the report doesn't mention is what we found in the ashes the next day. 12 mirror frames, warped but recognizable, their glass completely gone. The obsidian mirror's pedestal, unburned despite standing at the fire's epicenter. And a single taxidermy crow, completely untouched by flame or smoke, its glass eyes intact and watchful. I took the crow before anyone else could see it and locked it in evidence locker 13, where my father had kept something similar, and his father before him. I check it every morning to make sure it's still there, that the eyes haven't moved, that no dust has settled on its feathers. But lately, I've noticed something concerning. Something I haven't written in any report. Sometimes, when I look at the crow through the small window in the locker door, I don't see one crow. I see 13. 12 surrounding one. Watching. Waiting. And sometimes, in the right light, those glass eyes aren't empty anymore. They reflect something moving, coming closer to the surface with each passing day. I'm retiring next month, passing the badge to someone new. But I won't be passing on this burden. After I turn in my gun and badge, I'm taking that crow somewhere far away, somewhere deep enough that what's trapped inside can never find its way back to Coleridge. At least, that's what I keep telling myself. But the truth I've never admitted until now, is that I don't think it can be destroyed. And lately, when I look in my bathroom mirror while shaving, I swear I can see it perched on my shoulder, even though I know it's locked safely away. Its beak moves sometimes, like it's whispering something. And God help me, I'm starting to understand what it's saying. The taxidermy crow in our station's evidence locker changed position 3 times before I noticed the pattern. Each morning for a week, its glass eyes would be facing a different direction. That stiff-winged body somehow rotated inside its sealed evidence bag. Deputy Miller suggested rodents. Henderson blamed cleaning staff. I said nothing, but I started taking pictures, date-stamped, time-logged proof that something impossible was happening right under our noses. That was the beginning of what we now call the season of backward shadows, the summer when Black Veil lost 7 citizens and nearly its sanity. 43 years wearing this badge, and still, when the cottonwoods start shedding their fluff in late May, I feel my hand tremble just a little when I reach for my coffee mug. I'm Sheriff Thomas Gaines. Most folks around here call me Sheriff Tom, have been since '82. Black Veil sits nestled in the crease between 2 mountain ridges. Population 1,842 according to the faded sign that hasn't been updated since I was in my 40s. The kind of place where I know every family's history going back 4 generations, every feud, every scandal, every triumph. The kind of place where the exceptional rarely happens, and when it does, everyone pretends not to notice. That summer started unusually hot. By mid-May, we were already hitting temperatures we normally don't see until July. The creek beds dried up. The asphalt on Main Street got soft enough to leave boot prints if you stood still too long. The air smelled wrong, like dust and metal and something else I couldn't place. The first report came from Eliza Woodman at the Historical Society. A woman who'd spent her life cataloging the mundane details of our town's unremarkable history, suddenly calling the station at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning, her voice thin and stretched. "The photographs," she'd said, not bothering with hello. "Sheriff, the photographs in the East Wing display are wrong." I remember sighing before I answered, thinking this was just another case of teenage vandalism. "Wrong how, Eliza?" "The people," she whispered. "They're all facing the other way now." I drove over more out of courtesy than concern. Eliza had been alone too long since her husband passed. The Historical Society was housed in an old Victorian on Spruce Street, its rooms filled with artifacts nobody cared about except her, farming equipment, faded documents, and yes, hundreds of black and white photographs chronicling Black Veil's evolution from mining outpost to forgettable dot on the map. The East Wing held portraits from the 1880s through the 1920s. Stern faces, stiff poses. Nothing remarkable except what Eliza was pointing at with a shaking finger. "Look at them, Tom. Just look." At first, I didn't see it. Then I did. In every single photograph, the subjects were facing the opposite direction from what seemed natural. Men who should have been positioned to the left were facing right. Women whose bodies were angled one way had heads impossibly turned the other. It wasn't that the photos had been flipped, the text in some of them was still readable, not mirrored. It was as if every person had simply decided to look the wrong way at the moment the picture was taken. Could be a printing error when they were reproduced, I offered, not believing it myself. These were original prints, and I'd seen them before. They hadn't looked like this. Eliza's thin fingers gripped my uniform sleeve. I've worked with these photographs for 27 years, Sheriff. They've changed. And that's not all. She pulled me to a panoramic shot of Main Street circa 1902. The shadows are wrong. She was right. Every shadow in the photograph fell in the opposite direction from the visible sun in the image, as if light itself had forgotten its own rules. I took detailed notes, photographed everything, and told Eliza to lock up the display. Keep it between us for now. No sense causing a panic over what was probably just some elaborate prank or failing eyesight on both our parts. 3 days later, Marcus Hollow's son went missing. The Hollows lived on the edge of town, where the paved roads give way to gravel, then dirt. Their house backed up to the national forest that stretched unbroken for miles, all the way to the state line. The boy, Daniel, was 12. Smart kid. Not the type to wander off. Marcus called at dawn. Said he'd checked Daniel's room at midnight before turning in, then found the bed empty at 5 a.m. No signs of forced entry. No indications of struggle. Just the strange detail that Marcus kept repeating. His shadow is still here, Tom. I blamed it on hysteria, lack of sleep. But when I arrived, Marcus led me to Daniel's bedroom wall where, impossibly, the distinct silhouette of a seated boy was cast against the blue paint. It remained there even when I turned off the lights, even when I blocked every source of illumination. A perfect shadow with no source, darker than it should be, and completely still. We organized search parties, brought in dogs from the county, combed the forest for 6 days before we found Daniel's shoes, just his shoes, placed neatly at the base of a lightning-struck pine, 15 miles from the nearest trail. The soles were worn through completely, as if he'd walked hundreds of miles in them instead of just 15. The shadow remained on his bedroom wall for exactly 14 days before disappearing between 3 and 4 a.m. on a moonless night. By then, we had 2 more missing persons and 3 more impossible shadows left behind. Sarah Kettering, 78, vanished from the locked Alzheimer's unit at Black Veil Care Center. Her shadow remained in her favorite chair in the common room, hunched and still. Trevor Pike, 36, the high school chemistry teacher, disappeared while walking his dog. The dog returned. Trevor didn't. His shadow stood frozen beside the war memorial in the town square. I assembled a task force. Called in favors with the state police. They sent 2 detectives who spent exactly 6 hours in town before making excuses to leave. I saw their faces when they noticed how their own shadows sometimes moved a fraction of a second too late after they did. By day 19, we had 2 more missing. June Mercer from the pharmacy. Cal Wright, who drove the school bus. Their shadows appeared in places they frequented. June's behind the pharmacy counter, Kyle's on the side of the empty bus in the depot lot. The town grew quiet in a way that went beyond fear. People stopped making eye contact. Conversations died mid-sentence. At sundown, streets emptied. Curtains stayed drawn. I spent my nights reviewing security footage, interviewing families, and studying those damned shadows that should not exist. During the day, I noticed how people had started physically avoiding their own shadows, stepping around them, flinching when they moved. As if they'd become something separate, something predatory. The incident at the town hall meeting nearly broke us. 22 days into the disappearances, I called the community together. Safety in numbers, I thought. A chance to share information, quell rumors, present a united front against whatever was happening. 200 people packed the community center. I stood at the podium, throat dry, the weight of their expectations pressing down heavier than my badge ever had. I just started speaking when someone screamed. The wall behind me, cast in the glare of the overhead lights, had filled with shadows. Not just mine, but dozens, human shapes of all sizes, standing unnaturally still. Shadows that didn't match anyone in the room. Shadows that moved when no one moved. Panic erupted. In the chaos, I saw something I've never shared in any official report. As people rushed for the exits, some of their shadows stayed behind, just for a heartbeat, before snapping back to their owners like elastic pulled too tight. The seventh disappearance came that night. Little Mary Collins, age 9, taken from between her sleeping parents. Her shadow remained on her bedroom ceiling, not the wall, the ceiling, arms outstretched as if reaching for something. Or someone. On day 26, I found the crow. I'd been systematically searching the forest based on where Daniel's shoes had been discovered. The area had been combed multiple times, but I kept returning, drawn by something I couldn't articulate. That day, I went farther than before, following a dry creek bed that eventually opened into a small clearing I swear hadn't existed on any previous search. In the center stood a single dead tree, bleached white by sun and time. Nailed to it were hundreds of crow feathers, arranged in concentric circles. At the base lay 7 dead crows, positioned in a perfect star pattern, their wings extended. And there, scratched into the trunk at eye level, was a crude symbol, a human figure with its shadow reaching upward instead of falling to the ground. I took samples, photographs, measurements, called in the forensic team from the state. They found nothing useful. No fingerprints. No footprints despite the soft ground. The feathers belonged to common American crows. The birds had died from what the pathologists called natural cessation of biological functions, as if they'd simply decided to stop living all at once. That night, alone in my office with the case files spread around me, I noticed something in the photographs that turned my blood cold. The shadows cast by the dead crows in the clearing didn't match their positions. Each shadow showed a bird in flight, wings extended, rising from the ground where the actual birds lay motionless. I was still staring at this impossibility when Deputy Henderson burst through my door without knocking. "You need to see the evidence locker," he said. Now, the taxidermy crow that had started it all had changed again. Not just its position this time. The evidence bag contained nothing but dust and feathers, as if the bird had disintegrated. But on the wall behind the shelf, a perfect crow-shaped shadow remained, wings spread in flight. That's when I knew. The shadows weren't what was left behind after our people disappeared. They were what had taken them. I worked through the night, pulling old records, folklore, anything that might explain what we were facing. In the county archives, I found accounts from the original Black Veil settlement, descriptions of a winter in 1851 when shadows moved against nature's law, and 7 settlers vanished, leaving only darkness in their shape behind. Every 174 years. Almost to the day. By dawn, I had a theory but no solution. The shadows were doorways to somewhere else. Our missing citizens had been pulled through their own shadows into, what? Another dimension? Some dark parallel to our own. I couldn't say. But I knew the pattern would complete with 7 taken. I drove to Mary Collins' house as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the empty streets. Her parents sat hollow-eyed in their kitchen, her shadow still stretching impossibly across their ceiling. I explained what little I understood, what little I could offer. The pattern shows 7 taken, then it stops, I told them. But there might be a way to get them back. Ancient stories mentioned anchors, personal items of deep significance that could supposedly help the taken find their way home. Worth trying when logic and reason had failed us. For the next 3 days, families gathered treasured possessions, Daniel's baseball mitt, Sarah's wedding ring, Trevor's father's watch. We placed them beneath each lingering shadow as the town held vigil. Nothing happened. On the 33rd day, I woke before dawn with a realization that made me curse my own blindness. The taxidermy crow hadn't been just a harbinger. It had been trying to show us something. I drove to the clearing with the dead tree. The crow carcasses were gone, the feathers undisturbed. As the sun crested the eastern ridge, I studied how the shadows fell across the clearing. They all pointed to a section of ground that seemed no different from the rest. I started digging. 3 feet down, my shovel struck something solid. An old wooden box, its brass fittings green with age. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating cloth, I found 7 small figurines carved from some dark stone I didn't recognize. Each depicted a human form with an oversized shadow stretching behind it. I brought them back to town, placed one beneath each of the 7 persistent shadows, on walls, floors, ceilings. Nothing happened, not immediately. But as dusk approached, I noticed something changing. The shadows began to pulse slightly, to deepen. At exactly 8:43 p.m., Mary Collins' shadow on the ceiling began to stretch downward. It extended impossibly, forming a column of darkness that touched the stone figurine I'd placed on the floor. The shadow solidified, became 3-dimensional. And then Mary stepped out of it, unconscious but alive, her skin ice cold. One by one, over the next 6 hours, the missing returned through their shadows. All 7, alive but changed. Aged somehow, though only weeks had passed. None could speak of where they'd been. Their eyes held something I hoped never to understand. The shadows disappeared. The stone figurines crumbled to dust by morning. Life in Black Veil returned to what passes for normal, though I notice how people still flinch sometimes when their shadows fall a certain way. How they avoid talking about those 33 days. How they pretend not to see when, occasionally, a shadow moves just a fraction out of sync with its owner. I keep the evidence file locked in my bottom drawer. The photographs of impossible shadows. The taxidermy crow dust. My notes about the 174-year cycle that means no one in Black Veil now will be alive to face this again. But sometimes, in the late afternoon when the sun slants just so through my office blinds, I could swear I see that crow's shadow flutter across my wall, wings spread in flight. And I wonder, did we really stop something ancient, or just delay it? Did we rescue 7 souls, or merely bargain for their temporary return? Because the thing about shadows is this: they're always with us, attached at our feet, our hands, our history. Waiting. Watching. And perhaps, when we're not looking directly at them, remembering what they once were before light forced them into mere silhouettes of ourselves. I'm Sheriff Thomas Gaines, and I no longer trust what follows me in the darkness. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I take out my flashlight and create shadow puppets on my wall, innocuous shapes, a rabbit, a dog, and I watch intently, waiting to see if they move when my hands don't. So far they haven't. But the season of backward shadows taught me one thing for certain. In Black Veil, patience is more than a virtue. It's a strategy. And shadows, real shadows, are very, very patient indeed. The taxidermy bobcat in our evidence room has been turning to face the door on its own for 43 years. I've never mentioned it in any official report. I first noticed it back in '82, when I was just a deputy. That old cat, seized from a poacher named Tanner who'd been taking more than his share from the hills above Sawyer Creek, sat on the metal shelf in the corner gathering dust. It was posed mid-snarl, glass eyes reflecting nothing, its fur growing brittle with the passing seasons. Sheriff Dawson had kept it as a kind of trophy. Poacher caught, case closed. But one morning I came in early to file paperwork and noticed it had shifted, just slightly, its frozen snarl now aimed at the entrance rather than the wall. I figured someone had bumped the shelf. The following week, it had moved again. After the third time, I started marking its position with an invisible pencil line on the metal shelf. No one else seemed to notice or care about an old piece of taxidermy. But I watched it, and it moved, just a quarter inch or so every few days, always turning toward the door, as if waiting for someone to enter. I became sheriff in '89, after Dawson's heart gave out while he was fishing at Miller's Pond. By then, I'd stopped mentioning the bobcat to anyone. You learn quickly in a place like Hollow Creek that some peculiarities are best left unspoken. This town, nestled in the folded hills of eastern Kentucky where the trees grow thick and the hollers run deep, has always had its share of strangeness. But what happened in the summer of 2003 made a turning taxidermy cat seem like nothing at all. It began with a sound. Not the theatrical howl of wolves or the creak of old floorboards that storytellers are so fond of. It was the absence of a sound that should have been there. The curious dead spot on Old Pine Road where, for exactly 440 yards, you couldn't hear crickets. Hollow Creek has more crickets than people most summers. Their chorus rises with the evening dew and continues until dawn, a constant companion to those of us who prefer porch sitting to television. But on that stretch of road, the singing simply stopped. Drive 10 feet past the gnarled oak that marked the boundary of the Mason property, and the night fell silent as a tomb. Continued to the lightning-split hickory near the Thompson Creek crossing, and the crickets would suddenly resume as if someone had flipped a switch. I first noticed it on a routine patrol. Thought my hearing was going at first. I was pushing 60 then, with hair gone steel gray and knees that predicted rain better than any weatherman. But after 3 nights of the same silence, I knew something wasn't right. You ever notice anything strange about Old Pine Road? I asked Jerry, my most senior deputy, as we shared coffee before his evening shift. Jerry, who'd spent all 49 years of his life in Hollow Creek, simply shrugged. Always been a quiet stretch. No, not quiet. Silent. Specifically from the Mason Oak to Thompson Crossing. He looked at me with that particular expression locals reserve for conversations about the peculiar. Not dismissive, just cautious, like he was deciding how seriously to take it. In small towns like ours, you learn to walk the line between acknowledging the strange and inviting it closer. Now that you mention it, he said finally, my radio fuzzes out through there. Thought it was just the hills. That night, I brought a sound meter from the county emergency management office. Outside the zone, 62 decibels of natural night sounds. Inside, 28 decibels, just the soft rush of wind through leaves and the purr of my cruiser's engine. No insect sounds, no frogs from the nearby creek, nothing. The meter confirmed what my ears had told me. I might have left it at that, filed it away with the bobcat and the other oddities that decorate the corners of a long law enforcement career. But 3 days later, Marcus Fillmore disappeared. Marcus was 78, a retired coal miner with hands permanently stained black and lungs that whistled when he breathed. He lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, his wife 6 years in the ground. The kind of man who kept to himself but nodded politely when you passed him at Miller's General Store. His daughter from Cincinnati called me when he missed their weekly phone conversation. It's not like him, Sheriff, she said, worry tightening her voice. Daddy's got his routines. He doesn't break them, not for anything. A routine check of his house showed nothing amiss. The door was locked, his ancient Buick still in the carport. Inside, a half-drunk cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table beside his reading glasses and the previous day's newspaper, folded open to the crossword puzzle. 6 across remained unfinished. We organized search parties, combed the woods behind his property, checked the hospital in the next county, called his few friends. Nothing. On the third day of searching, I found his walking stick. It was lying in the center of Old Pine Road, directly in the middle of that silent zone. A gnarly piece of hickory, worn smooth at the handle from years of use. I'd seen Marcus leaning on it 100 times, navigating the uneven sidewalks of our small town. He wouldn't have willingly parted with it. His knees were worse than mine. I stood in that unnatural quiet, holding his stick, and felt the hairs on my neck rise. The silence seemed to press against my eardrums, a physical presence rather than an absence. For the first time, I noticed that the air felt different there, heavier, with a metallic taste that coated the tongue. I bagged the walking stick as evidence and expanded our search grid, focusing on the silent zone. By sundown, we'd found nothing else. That night, alone in my office with the door closed, I'd pulled out the county archives, the heavy leather-bound books where records were kept before computers took over. Hollow Creek's history isn't entirely written down. Much of it lives in stories passed down, in warnings from grandparents, in the collective memory of families who've lived on the same land for generations. But there are patterns if you know where to look. 3 hours of reading revealed that Marcus wasn't the first disappearance along that stretch of road. In 1964, a traveling salesman's car was found abandoned there, his sample cases neatly stacked in the trunk. In 1978, a young woman walking home from her shift at the diner was never seen again, her purse discovered in the ditch near the Mason Oak. In 1991, an entire family moving through town stopped to fix a flat tire. The car remained, Jack still propping up the frame, spare tire leaning against the rear bumper. No sign of struggle. No tracks leading away. Just emptiness. All of them, I realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning, had vanished during the first week of July. The same week Marcus had gone missing. The same week I'd first noticed the silence. As if summoned by my thoughts, the evidence room door clicked open. I looked up, expecting to see Jerry returning from patrol. The doorway stood empty. Beyond it, in the shadowed room, I could just make out the silhouette of the taxidermied bobcat, now fully turned to face me, its glass eyes catching the light from my office like twin flames. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, Marcus had been missing for 4 days, and I had developed a theory I wasn't ready to share. Instead, I went to visit the oldest person in Hollow Creek, Ida Mae Thornton, 96 years old and sharper than most people half her age. Ida Mae lived in a small house filled with the collected memorabilia of nearly a century. Photographs covered every surface, yellowed with age, showing the evolution of our town from a bustling coal community to the quiet backwater it had become. She welcomed me with strong coffee served in delicate china cups that had belonged to her mother. "You're not here for social niceties, John," she said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. Ida Mae had been my third-grade teacher before she retired. She still called me by my first name, Sheriff's badge be damned. "Something's troubling you." "It's about Old Pine Road," I said, watching her carefully. "That stretch past the Mason property." Her hand, still steady despite her age, paused ever so slightly as she stirred sugar into her coffee. Anyone else might have missed it. "What about it?" Her voice remained casual, but her eyes had gone sharp as tacks. "Marcus Fillmore disappeared there 3 days ago. And he's not the first." Ida Mae set down her cup with a soft clink. "No," she said quietly. "He wouldn't be." The confirmation sent a chill through me. "What is it, Ida Mae? What happens on that road?" She looked past me, out the window where her bird feeders hung motionless in the still summer air. "We don't talk about it. That was the agreement." "What agreement?" "The one the town made. Back in '35, before you were born." She sighed, her thin shoulders sagging beneath the weight of memory. There was a cave-in at the North Mine, collapsed with 28 men inside. I nodded. I knew about the disaster. It was commemorated with a small plaque outside the town hall. But I didn't see the connection. They only found 27 bodies, she continued. The 28th man was Samuel Pine, the road's namesake, I realized. I'd never questioned why a dusty stretch of county backroad carried a family name. For weeks after, people reported seeing Samuel walking that road at night, covered in coal dust, carrying his lunch pail. Then people started disappearing. Her voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. Just one or two at first. But by 37, it was nearly one a month. The town was dying of fear. What happened? Reverend Mason, that would be old Elijah, the current Mason's grandfather. He said he knew how to stop it. Said his grandmother came from people who knew about such things, back in the old country. Ida May's eyes had taken on a faraway look. He performed some kind of ritual. Used objects from each of the missing. Said he was binding the spirit to a compact. A compact? An agreement. The spirit would be permitted one soul every 7 years, during the first week of July. In return, it would leave the rest of the town in peace. The coffee turned to acid in my stomach. And the town agreed to this? Ida May's gaze returned to me, hard as flint. It was a different time, John. People were desperate. And it worked. The disappearances stopped except for one person every 7 years in July. I finished. She nodded. Always strangers at first. Travelers passing through. No one who'd be missed here. But as the town's gotten smaller, as fewer people come through, it started taking locals, I said, thinking of Marcus with his routine and his crossword puzzles. The compact must be honored, she said, with the grim certainty of someone reciting an irrefutable law of nature. One soul freely given or taken by force. Either way, it must be fed. And no one's ever tried to stop it. To break this compact? Her expression told me everything before she spoke. Those who tried didn't live to regret it. The punishment for breaking the agreement is worse than the agreement itself. I left Ida May's house with more questions than answers, but one certainty had crystallized in my mind. I would not sacrifice Marcus, or anyone else, to some ancient bargain made before I was born. That evening, I returned to Old Pine Road alone. The sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of amber and deep purple. I parked my cruiser at the Mason Oak and stepped into the silence. The absence of sound was even more pronounced at dusk. No birds settling in for the night, no crickets warming up for their evening chorus, no distant barking of farm dogs. Just the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the sound of my own breathing. I'd brought with me a small tape recorder, ancient technology by modern standards, but simple and reliable. Setting it on the hood of my cruiser, I pressed record and spoke into the oppressive silence. My name is Sheriff John Hollister. It's July 7th, 2003. I'm on Old Pine Road. I paused, feeling somewhat foolish yet compelled to continue. I know about the compact. I know what's been happening here for decades. And I'm here to end it. The silence absorbed my words like a sponge. No echo, no reverberation. Samuel Pine, I said clearly, addressing the empty air. I want to make a new agreement. The metallic taste in the air intensified. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, despite the summer evening warmth. I forced myself to continue. Take me instead of Marcus Fillmore. Return him safely, and I'll go willingly. Nothing happened for several long moments. The sun slipped lower, shadows lengthening across the road. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, a sound began to emerge from the silence. A hollow tapping, like knuckles on wood, Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me in the unnatural quiet. As it grew louder, I realized it wasn't knuckles at all. It was the sound of a miner's pick striking stone, slow and deliberate. The air before me shimmered, like heat rising from summer asphalt. The shimmer darkened, condensed, gradually taking on a human shape. A man-sized silhouette of absolute darkness stood 20 feet away, featureless except for two faintly glowing points where eyes should be. It carried something in its right hand, a lunch pail, I thought at first, before recognizing the distinctive shape of an old miner's helmet. The tapping stopped. The figure stood motionless, watching me. My mouth had gone dry as bone, but I forced myself to speak again. "Do we have a deal? My life for Marcus Fillmore's?" The figure tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture from something so obviously not human. When it spoke, the voice seemed to bypass my ears entirely, manifesting directly in my mind like an intrusive thought. Why would I trade a soul already promised for one that will come to me eventually? The voice carried the hollow echo of deep underground spaces, of tunnels extending into darkness. It resonated in my chest cavity, making my ribs vibrate uncomfortably. "Because I'm offering myself freely," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "There's power in that, isn't there? In willing sacrifice?" The figure took a step closer. The air around it seemed darker somehow, as if it absorbed light rather than merely blocking it. "You know nothing of power, John Hollister. Nothing of sacrifice." "I know enough," I replied, standing my ground despite every instinct screaming at me to run. "I know your compact is with the town, not with me. I never agreed to your terms." The figure moved closer still. The cold intensified, my breath now visible in the summer air. "You benefit from the protection. All of you do. One soul every 7 years keeps the hunger contained. Would you rather I take as I please? No one else should die for this," I said. "No more bargains, no more sacrifices." The figure was now close enough that I could see there was nothing solid within its silhouette, just a deeper darkness, a void in the shape of a man. The glowing eyes fixed on mine. "Then offer something better." My mind raced. What could I possibly offer this thing that would be worth more than a human life? What would satisfy a hunger that had persisted for nearly 7 decades? Then I remembered something Ida May had mentioned. The objects used in the original ritual, items belonging to each of the missing. Physical connections, anchors to memory and identity. "Rest," I said suddenly. "I offer you rest." The figure went perfectly still. "Explain." "You've been trapped here for 68 years, bound to this road by Reverend Mason's ritual. Taking souls but never moving on." I took a deep breath. "I'm offering to help you find peace instead." The silhouette rippled, like dark water disturbed by a stone. "There is no peace for me. I never left the mine." And suddenly I understood. "Your body. It's still down there, isn't it? Never recovered." The figure said nothing, but the glowing eyes flared briefly. "That's why you're bound here. Not just by the ritual, but because you can't leave while your remains are still trapped." I thought of all those disappearances over the decades, the lives cut short. "Let me help you. Let me bring you home, give you a proper burial. End this cycle." For a long moment, the figure remained motionless. Then it extended its empty hand toward me. "Lead the way, Sheriff." What followed was the strangest night of my long career. I drove to the abandoned North Mine, the dark figure somehow now seated in my passenger seat, though I never saw it enter the vehicle. The mine had been sealed after the disaster, the entrance blocked with concrete and warning signs. But the figure directed me to a second entrance, overgrown and forgotten, half a mile around the hillside. I brought a flashlight and an old mining helmet with a lamp that I found in the department's storage. The beam seemed feeble against the absolute darkness of the tunnel, barely illuminating the rotting support beams and rusted tracks underfoot. The figure glided ahead of me, making no sound, occasionally passing through obstacles rather than around them. We descended deeper into the earth, the air growing thick with coal dust and the particular musty smell of spaces long undisturbed by human presence. After what felt like hours, we reached a section where the tunnel ceiling had collapsed. Massive chunks of rock and splintered timber created an impassable barrier. The figure stopped. There. I played my light over the rubble. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just fallen rock and debris. Then a glint of metal caught my eye. Moving closer, I spotted what appeared to be a lunch pail, crushed and half buried. Near it, protruding from beneath a large slab of rock, was what I first took to be a piece of mine equipment. It was a human hand, mummified by time and the unique conditions of the mine, still remarkably preserved. The sleeve of a work shirt was visible at the wrist, the fabric stiff with coal dust and age. Now you understand. I did. The 28th body, never recovered. Samuel Pine, trapped beneath tons of rock, his spirit unable to rest while his physical remains lay abandoned in darkness. I'll need equipment, I said. Help. I can't move these rocks alone. You won't need to. The figure moved to the rockfall and placed its insubstantial hand on the largest boulder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a distant thunderclap, the rocks shifted. Dust billowed up, forcing me to cover my mouth and nose with my sleeve. When it cleared, a narrow path had opened through the debris. Beyond it lay the remains of Samuel Pine, remarkably intact after decades underground. He had died sitting against the tunnel wall, legs outstretched, as if he'd simply sat down to rest after the ceiling came down, knowing there was no escape. His mummified features were frozen in an expression not of terror but of resignation. I removed my jacket and gently wrapped the remains, speaking softly as I worked, explaining what I was doing and why. The figure watched in silence, its glow gradually dimming as I gathered the last physical connection it had to this world. The journey back to the surface was challenging. The remains were lighter than I'd expected, desiccated by time, but awkward to carry through the narrow mine passages. Dawn was breaking as I emerged from the hillside, the bundle cradled in my arms like sleeping child. The figure followed, but something had changed. In the growing light of day, it seemed less substantial, its edges blurring into the morning mist. I placed the remains in my cruiser and drove directly to Holloway Funeral Home. Norma Holloway, the third-generation proprietor, asked no questions when I arrived unannounced at her front door with my grim bundle. In small towns like ours, some situations transcend normal protocol. Samuel Pine, I said simply. Found in the North Mine. She nodded, understanding immediately. I'll take care of him. Proper burial? The best you can do. As she took the bundle from me, I felt rather than saw the dark figure dissipate completely, like smoke in a strong breeze. 3 hours later, Marcus Fillmore walked out of the woods near Old Pine Road, confused and dehydrated but otherwise unharmed. He remembered nothing of the previous 4 days. That afternoon, while he was still being checked over at the clinic, I returned to the silent stretch of road. Except it wasn't silent anymore. Crickets chirped in the underbrush. A mockingbird called from the mason oak. The oppressive feeling had lifted, the metallic taste gone from the air. The compact was broken, the hunger appeased not with another sacrifice but with long-delayed peace. Samuel Pine was laid to rest in the town cemetery a week later, his grave marked with a simple stone. The official story, that his body had finally been located during a routine inspection of the old mine, satisfied most people. Those who knew or suspected more kept their thoughts to themselves, the way folks in small towns often do with uncomfortable truths. I expected some sort of supernatural backlash for breaking the decades-old agreement, but none came. The disappearances stopped. Old Pine Road became just another country backroad, unremarkable except for the abundance of wildflowers that inexplicably began to grow along its edges. I never told anyone the full story, not until now, years after my retirement. Some secrets are burdens that grow heavier with time, demanding eventually to be shared. As for the taxidermy bobcat in the evidence room, it stopped moving after that summer. When I left the department, it was still facing the door, its glass eyes dulled with dust, just an ordinary relic of an ordinary case. But sometimes, on summer nights when the crickets sing especially loud, I think about the compact that bound our town for so long, and wonder what other agreements have been made in other small places, what prices are being paid, what hungers are being fed, what silences are being preserved. And I listen, carefully, for the hollow sound of absence where there should be noise. Pine needles crunch beneath my boots as I walk this familiar trail, yet the forest feels different tonight. 30 years have passed since that autumn, but time hasn't dulled the memory. It's only made it sharper, like a knife honed against stone. The moon hangs bloated above the ridge, casting the same sickly yellow light it did back then, and I feel the weight of my retired badge like a phantom limb. Some cases get filed away. Others get solved. But there's one that lives in the marrow of my bones, surfacing whenever the wind shifts a certain way or when the mist settles thick in Blackwater Valley. It was late October, 1993. The kind of autumn that comes on slow, then all at once. Leaves had turned crimson and gold earlier than usual, and there was already frost kissing the ground most mornings. Folks said it would be a harsh winter. They had no idea what kind of cold was coming. The call came just after 3 a.m. Dispatch's voice crackling through the radio, tight with something I couldn't name. A hiker reported strange lights out by Widow's Creek, and what sounded like someone calling for help, over and over, but never quite loud enough to make out the words. I remember sliding the window down as I drove out there, letting the night air flood the cruiser. It smelled wrong. Not the usual pine sap and loam, but something acrid, like ozone after lightning strikes too close. My headlights caught the fog rolling in from the hollows, thick as cream and twice as cold. The county road to Widow's Creek winds through 5 miles of dense forest before opening into a small clearing with access to the trailhead. As I rounded the last bend, my high beams swept across something that made me brake hard enough to feel the seat belt bite into my shoulder. A car sat abandoned in the clearing, driver's door left wide open. Not unusual for hikers, except for 3 things. The engine was still running, the headlights were on full beam pointing into the trees, and there was a perfect circle of frost radiating outward from the vehicle. Just frost, in a perfect ring, like something had sucked all the warmth from that single spot while leaving the rest untouched. I called it in, then pulled my mag light from under the seat. The beams seemed weaker than usual as I stepped out, like the darkness was drinking the light. My breath clouded before me in plumes that drifted and held, unnaturally still in the windless night. The car was a blue Subaru, late 80s model. Inside, a woman's purse on the passenger seat, a half-drunk coffee in the cup holder, still warm to the touch, and a map unfolded across the steering wheel. The engine's idle was the only sound for miles. No night birds, no insects rasping in the underbrush. Just the low rumble of that engine and my own breathing, loud in my ears. The woman's license in the wallet said Elaine Mercer, 34, from the next county over. No local. I tried the radio to run her plates, but all I got was static, a low moan that rose and fell like someone breathing through a damaged throat. The forest felt like it was leaning in, watching, waiting. I'd known these woods my entire life. Hunted in them since I was a boy, patrolled them for 22 years by that point. I knew every trail, every clearing, every seasonal creek bed. But standing there, with that perfect circle of frost, and that empty car with its engine still running, I felt like a stranger in a place I'd never set foot before. A sound came then, not quite a voice, not quite a whistle. Something in between, rising from the direction of Widow's Creek. It sounded like my name, almost. Not quite right, like someone who'd only read it was trying to pronounce it. Against every instinct screaming at me to get back in my cruiser, I unholstered my sidearm and followed that sound. The trail to Widow's Creek was narrow, barely visible in the moonlight. My flashlight beam seemed to stop short, as if the darkness had substance, thickness. The trees loomed closer to the path than I remembered, their bark glistening with moisture though it hadn't rained in days. And they seemed wrong somehow. The texture was off, the patterns of the bark resembling something else, something I couldn't quite place. That sound came again, closer now. A hollow echo of a human voice, stretched and thinned until it was almost unrecognizable. Almost. The air grew colder with each step, until my lungs ached with it. 20 minutes in, I noticed my footprints behind me were filling with a thin layer of frost, each one a perfect outline of my boot. When I stopped to look, I saw they extended back as far as I could see, a glowing trail marking my path. Up ahead, Widow's Creek cut through the forest floor like a black vein. It wasn't much more than a trickle most of the year, a narrow, rocky streambed that wound its way down from the ridge. But the autumn rains had swelled it to a proper creek. The water looked viscous in the moonlight, too thick to be water, too fluid to be anything else. Something moved on the far bank. Not a deer, not a bear. It moved upright but wrong. Like it was wearing the idea of a human shape rather than actually being one. "Police!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and useless. "Identify yourself." No response, but it stopped moving. Stood there, a darker patch against the darkness, watching me. I could feel it watching, though I couldn't make out eyes or a face. My flashlight flickered, died, came back dimmer than before. In that moment of darkness, the figure moved. Not toward me, not away. It was just, in a different position when the light returned. As if it had rearranged itself while I couldn't see. "Ma'am?" I tried, thinking of Elaine Mercer. "Are you hurt? Do you need assistance?" The thing tilted what might have been its head. The movement was too fluid, too extensive, like its neck had too many vertebrae. Then came that sound again, from it or around it or through it, I couldn't tell. But it was clearer now. It was saying my name. Not Sheriff, not my surname. My first name, the one only my mother used, the one that hadn't been spoken aloud since she passed 12 years earlier. "What do you want?" My voice cracked, betraying me. It raised an arm, too long, too thin, and pointed upstream. Then it was gone. Not like it had walked away or run off. It was simply not there anymore, as if someone had erased it from existence between one heartbeat and the next. I should have gone back. Called for backup, waited for daylight. That's what the manual would say, what common sense demanded. But there was something about the way it had said my name. Something lost. Desperate. And so I followed where it had pointed, moving upstream along the bank of Widow's Creek. The trees grew denser here, their branches weaving together overhead until no moonlight penetrated. My failing flashlight carved a tunnel through perfect darkness. The only sounds were the soft gurgle of the creek, the crunch of my boots on fallen leaves, and a persistent ringing in my ears that hadn't been there before. The creek bent sharply around a large boulder, and as I rounded it, I saw the lights. They hung in the air like fireflies, but larger and perfectly still. A dozen or more, suspended at various heights, casting a blue-white glow that didn't seem to illuminate anything around them. They were arranged in a loose circle around a small clearing. In the center of that circle was a body. She lay on her back, arms at her sides, looking for all the world like she was just resting. Elaine Mercer, I presumed, though her face was obscured by a strange distortion in the air above it, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. Her clothes were dried despite lying on the damp ground, and there wasn't a mark on her that I could see. But as I approached, the ringing in my ears grew louder, and a pressure built in my head like I was diving too deep underwater. Every step toward her was harder than the last, as if I was pushing against an invisible current. 10 feet away, I hit something solid. Not a wall, nothing visible at all. But my hand couldn't move forward, pressing flat against something that gave slightly, like a membrane. Cold radiated from it, a deep, penetrating cold that numbed my fingers within seconds. The lights pulsed once, in unison. The distortion above the woman's face rippled. And then I heard them. Voices, dozens overlapping, all speaking at once in a language I didn't recognize. They seemed to come from the lights themselves, or perhaps from the air between them. The ringing in my ears rose to a painful whine, and I dropped to one knee, pressing my palms against my temples. Through watering eyes, I saw the distortion above the woman spread, stretching wider until it formed a kind of window in the air. And through that window... No. Even now, I can't bring myself to describe what I saw. Not in full. It wasn't a place, not as we understand places. It was somewhere else, somewhere that operated under different laws than ours. And there were things moving there, things that saw me looking. One reached toward the window. Its limb, not an arm, not a tentacle, something that existed in too many dimensions at once, extended through. I fired my gun. Not at the woman, not at the lights. At that thing reaching through. Each shot sounded muted, like I was firing underwater, but the bullets hit something. The window shuddered with each impact, rippling like the surface of a pond. On the 6th shot, it collapsed, folded in on itself with a sound like the world's largest bedsheet being torn in half. The lights winked out all at once. Darkness crashed over me like a physical wave, and I fell backward, my head striking something hard. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was a whisper, right against my ear. Not yet. But soon. I woke at dawn, my clothes stiff with frost despite the temperature being well above freezing. The clearing was empty. No body, no lights, nothing to suggest anything had happened there at all. Even the ground where Elaine Mercer had lain showed no indentation, no disturbance of the leaves and pine needles. I made my way back to the trailhead, each step heavy with dread of what I'd find. But the blue Subaru was gone. No tire tracks leading away, no sign it had ever been there except for that perfect circle of frost, already melting in the morning sun. I called in the plates when I got back to the station. Elaine Mercer was reported missing 3 days later by her brother. Her car was found 2 weeks after that, parked neatly in her own garage, keys on the kitchen counter. No signs of foul play, no signs of Elaine. The case remains open. Unsolved. But every year, on the anniversary of that night, the same circle of frost appears in that clearing. And once, 3 years ago, I went back. Stood in that circle at 3 a.m. and waited. Nothing came. But as I was leaving, I found footprints in the frost behind me. Not mine, these were barefoot, narrow, with too many toes. They followed my trail exactly, stopping whenever I had stopped, as if someone, something, had been standing directly behind me the entire time. I haven't been back since. But sometimes, on cold autumn nights when the moon hangs swollen in the sky, I hear that whisper again. Not yet. But soon. And lately, I've been noticing a circle of frost around my house in the mornings. I never did figure out what happened to Elaine Mercer. But I think very soon now, I'm going to find out. Because last night, I saw lights in my backyard. Blue-white, perfectly still. And for the first time in 30 years, I heard that sound again. Not quite a voice, not quite a whistle. Saying my name. The fog came first, then the silence. Anyone who's spent their life in Crestfall County knows our fogs aren't like normal fogs. They don't just roll in, they seep, like something bleeding through from somewhere else. This particular September fog seemed to swallow sound itself, turning the world cotton soft and eerily muted. I remember standing on my porch that morning, coffee mug steaming in the chill air, watching as the mist devoured the old oak at the edge of my property inch by inch until nothing remained but a ghostly outline. I wasn't sheriff then, just Deputy Harlan, fresh-faced despite my 40 years, still believing I understood the difference between what's possible and what isn't. By evening, that certainty would be gone forever. The call crackled over my radio at 6:17 a.m. Dispatch's voice sounded thin, distant, though she was only 5 miles away at the station. Something about the fog seemed to stretch even radio waves. "Deputy, we've got a situation out at Hollow Creek. Caller says there's something unusual at the old Mercer property. Sheriff Collins is dealing with that highway accident by the county line. You're closest." I knew the place. Everyone did. The Mercer homestead had stood empty for nearly a decade, ever since the old man died and his children scattered to the winds, too eager to escape our little corner of nowhere. The property sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through pine woods so dense they seemed to consume daylight. Locals avoided it, not because of any specific story, mind you, but because of that instinctive avoidance people develop toward places that feel wrong. As I drove, the fog thickened until my headlights reflected back at me, useless against the soup-like atmosphere. The police-issue Broncos tires crunched over fallen pine needles that carpeted the road, the sound oddly muffled. My dashboard clock read 6:43 a.m. when I finally pulled up to the rusted gate of the Mercer property. The air outside had a metallic tang to it, like pennies left too long in the sun. That's the first detail I remember clearly, that unnatural smell cutting through the usual forest scents of pine sap and damp earth. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since I'd left town, though we were only 7 miles out. My breath clouded before me as I stepped from the vehicle, service revolver heavy on my hip. The caller was nowhere to be seen. Just the abandoned farmhouse, its weathered clapboards the color of old bones, standing sentinel against the backdrop of twisted oaks and pines. Windows like empty eye sockets. A porch that sagged in the middle like a broken spine. "Hello?" My voice didn't carry. It was as if the fog swallowed the sound whole, consumed it before it could travel more than a few feet. "County Sheriff's Department. Anyone here?" Nothing but the soft patter of condensation dripping from pine needles. I should have called for backup. That's what protocol demanded. But in small departments like ours, backup often meant waiting an hour for someone to drive out from town. And something, call it curiosity, call it stubbornness, pushed me forward, through the rusted gate that shrieked in protest despite the oil of the fog. The gravel driveway crunched under my boots, each step sending tiny echoes across the silent property. As I approached the house, I noticed something odd about the fog. It seemed to thin out in a perfect circle around the building, as if reluctant to touch the structure itself. I've seen many natural phenomena in my years wearing this badge, but never anything like that unnatural boundary, that perfect delineation between dense fog and clear air. The porch steps groaned under my weight, the wood soft with rot. Each board felt like it might give way, sending me plummeting into whatever darkness waited below. The smell grew stronger here, that metallic tang now mixed with something else, something that reminded me of the ozone scent after lightning strikes. My hand hovered over my holster, though what I thought I might need to shoot, I couldn't have told you. The front door stood slightly ajar. Not broken, just open, as if someone had recently passed through and forgotten to close it behind them. Or perhaps been interrupted before they could. "Hello? This is Deputy Harlan with the County Sheriff's Department. Is anyone in there?" The house answered with a sigh, not human, but the settling of old timbers, the whisper of air through cracks in the walls. I pushed the door open wider, wincing at the low, pained creak of rusted hinges. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a decade of abandonment. Dust-covered furniture draped in yellowed sheets, floorboards warped from years of humidity creeping in through broken window panes, cobwebs stretched like funeral shrouds across doorways. Except for one thing, a path through the dust, recent enough that the particles hadn't yet settled back into place. Someone had walked through here, and not long ago. I followed the trail, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The path led through the foyer, past the grand staircase whose banister had long since collapsed, and into what must have once been a study. Oak bookshelves lined the walls, most now empty of anything but dust and the occasional forgotten tome too worthless for the heirs to claim. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface bare except for a single object. A pocket watch. Not antique, not valuable looking. Just the ordinary silver pocket watch, the kind you might find in any department store. It sat precisely in the center of the desk, its chain coiled neatly beside it. In a room thick with dust, that watch gleamed as if freshly polished. I approached slowly, that instinct for caution honed by 20 years of police work screaming at me to back away instead. The room felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Static electricity made the hair on my arms stand on end beneath my uniform sleeve. That metallic smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water and my throat constrict. The watch wasn't ticking. I could see that even before I reached the desk. Its hands were frozen at 3:42, though whether AM or PM was impossible to tell. Something about those specific numbers sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't have explained why. "This is what you called about." I spoke aloud, though I knew no one was there to answer. My voice sounded strange, hollow, as if I were speaking inside a metal drum. "A damn pocket watch?" As if in response, the temperature plummeted. My next breath came out as a cloud so thick it momentarily obscured my vision. The windows began to rattle in their frames, gently at first, then with increasing violence. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like something alive, something desperate to get in. And then I made my mistake. I reached for the watch. My fingers had barely brushed its surface when pain shot up my arm. Not electric, not burning, but something worse. Something that felt like my very atoms were being pulled apart and reassembled wrong. I jerked back with a shout, but it was too late. The watch had fallen open. Inside was not the expected watch face, but something that defied comprehension. A swirling darkness that seemed to have depth beyond what the small case could possibly contain. It was like looking down a well that stretched to the center of the earth, or up into a sky devoid of stars. My mind couldn't process what my eyes were seeing, and for that, I remained grateful. What happened next came in fragments, snapshots of experience my brain refused to string together into a coherent narrative. The windows imploding, glass shards hanging suspended in air for impossible seconds. The fog pouring in, not like vapor but like liquid, thick and purposeful. The sound, God, the sound, like 1,000 voices whispering at once, words just beyond comprehension. The pocket watch rising from the desk, hovering, its chain writhing like a living thing. And through it all, a figure taking shape in the corner of the room. Not human, not animal, but something that seemed to be made of the fog itself, dense in some places, transparent in others. It had no face that I could discern, yet I felt its attention fixed on me with terrible intensity. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 20 years of police work, confronting everything from armed robbers to domestic abusers, and nothing had prepared me for what was happening in that room. I ran, boots pounding against warped floorboards, lungs burning with that metallic air, heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, became a roar that filled the house, made the walls bulge outward as if struggling to contain something much larger than their physical boundaries should allow. The fog chased me, tendrils of it reaching for my ankles, my back, my neck. I burst through the front door, across the porch, down the steps, and stopped dead. The world outside had changed. My Bronco was gone. The driveway was gone. The gate was gone. Even the trees looked wrong, taller, older, twisted into unnatural shapes. And the fog had become a wall around the property, a perfect circle with the house at its center. Beyond that wall, I could see nothing but swirling, impenetrable whiteness. From inside the house came a sound like metal tearing, like reality itself being ripped at the seams. The ground beneath my feet trembled. Behind me, the house seemed to inhale, wood creaking as walls bowed inward. And then silence. Complete, perfect silence. I stood there, frozen, for how long I couldn't say. Time itself felt fragile, unreliable. Eventually, I forced myself to turn back toward the house. It looked normal. Abandoned, decrepit, but just a house. The fog had retreated to its original boundary, that perfect circle that refused to touch the structure. The air still tasted of metal, but fainter now, mixed with the scent of damp wood and moldering leaves. Somehow, my flashlight was still in my hand, though I had no memory of holding onto it during my flight from the house. I switched it on, its beam weakened the strengthening daylight, and forced myself to do what every instinct screamed against. I went back inside. The study was empty. No hovering pocket watch, no imploded windows, no figure made of fog. Just dust and abandonment and the weight of decades. Even the trail through the dust was gone, as if no one had walked here in years. I searched the entire house, room by room, floor by floor, finding nothing but emptiness and decay. By the time I finished, the fog outside had begun to lift, revealing my Bronco parked exactly where I'd left it. The world had returned to normal, or what passed for normal in Crestfall County. I drove back to the station in silence, the radio switched off, windows rolled down despite the chill. The smell of pine and earth and approaching autumn had never seemed so precious, so sane. Sheriff Collins was waiting, brow furrowed with concern. "Harlan? Dispatch said you went out to the Mercer place hours ago. Everything all right?" "Hours?" I checked my watch. 2:17 p.m. I'd been gone nearly 8 hours, though it felt like no more than one. "False alarm," I heard myself say. "No one there." He studied me, those shrewd eyes missing nothing, not the pallor of my skin, the tremor in my hands, the way I couldn't quite meet his gaze. "You sure about that?" I nodded. What else could I do? Tell him about fog that moved with purpose? About pocket watches containing impossible depths? About figures made of mist? He'd have had me turning in my badge and seeking psychiatric help before sunset. So I filed my report, trespassing suspected but no evidence found, property secure, case closed, and tried to forget. For a while, I almost succeeded. 3 days later, they found Martin Geller's body in the woods half a mile from the Mercer property. Martin, the local mechanic, father of 2, coach of the Little League team. Martin, who had no business being out in those woods, especially not in the middle of the night. Martin, whose body showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of foul play, nothing to explain why a healthy 42-year-old man's heart would simply stop beating. Martin, whose pocket had been torn open, as if something had been forcibly removed. The coroner listed his time of death as approximately 3:42 a.m. I said nothing. Did nothing. What could I have done? But I knew, God help me, I knew, that whatever had happened at the Mercer house that foggy morning wasn't over. It had just begun. Over the next year, 4 more deaths followed. Different victims, different circumstances, but always the same details. No cause of death, a torn pocket, and a time of death estimated at 3:42, whether a.m. or p.m. And always, reports of unusually thick fog in the area when the bodies were discovered. I became sheriff 3 years later when Collins retired. By then, the deaths had stopped, though the fog still came, thick and unnatural, several times a year. Locals learned to stay indoors when it rolled in. Children were forbidden from playing outside until it lifted. Life adjusted, as it always does to unexplained terrors that become routine. I never returned to the Mercer property. Never filed a follow-up report. Never told anyone what I saw there. But I did keep track of the deaths, not just the 5 that followed my visit, but deaths throughout the county's history. It took years of careful research, sifting through old newspapers, coroner's reports, historical society records. A pattern emerged, so subtle no one had noticed it before. Every 17 years, like clockwork, a cluster of unexplained deaths. Always 5. Always during periods of unusual fog. Always with that same detail, a torn pocket, as if something had been taken. The pocket watch had been making its rounds for far longer than I'd realized. I'm retiring next month. My replacement is young, earnest, believes in forensic science and logical explanations. I should tell him about the pattern, warn him that we're coming up on another 17-year mark. I should tell him to board up the Mercer house, salt the earth around it, post guards during foggy days. But I won't. Because I know it wouldn't matter. Whatever walks in that fog, whatever reaches out through that pocket watch, can't be stopped by boards or salt or guns. It's patient. It's precise. And it's been here far longer than us. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, I take out my own pocket watch, an heirloom from my grandfather, nothing like the one I saw that day. I check the time, then check my digital watch to confirm they match. They always do. But for a split second, just as I'm closing the case, I catch a glimpse of something swirling inside, something dark and deep and hungry. And I wonder, when my time comes, will it be at 3:42? Will they find me with a torn pocket and no mark upon my body? Will the fog roll in thick that day, tasting of metal and wrongness? Or perhaps I've already been marked, have been since that morning at the Mercer house. Perhaps I'm simply waiting, like the others, for the hour hand and the minute hand to align just so, for the unseen gears to complete their inevitable rotation. The fog is rolling in as I write this. I can see it from my window, unusually thick for April, moving against the wind. Moving with purpose. My pocket watch sits beside me on the desk. I haven't touched it in days, but sometimes, from the corner of my eye, I swear I see the lid lifting on its own, just a fraction of an inch, as if something inside is peering out. It's 3:37 p.m. I should run. I should get in my car and drive until this county is nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. Instead, I find myself reaching for the watch, drawn by a compulsion I can't explain and can't resist. Its metal is cold against my palm, colder than it should be. The lid resists slightly when I try to open it, then yields with a soft click that sounds like finality. 3:39 p.m. Through the window, I can see the fog has reached my front gate. It pauses there, gathering itself, a predator assessing its territory. I should close the curtains. I should lock the doors. I should call for help. 3:40 p.m. The watch in my hand is growing colder, so cold it burns. Inside, the hands tick forward with agonizing slowness. The fog has reached my porch now, seeping through the cracks around my front door, tentacles of white probing beneath the frame. 3:41 p.m. I understand now. I understand what the pocket watch is, what the fog contains. Not death. That would be too simple, too merciful. The watch doesn't end lives, it collects them, preserves them. Like insects in amber, moments frozen forever in that swirling darkness. The hands align. 3:42 p.m. The fog is in the room with me now, and it's not alone. I can see them taking shape within it. Martin Geller, the others from 17 years ago, faces from newspaper clippings dating back a century or more. All standing, all watching, all waiting to welcome one more into their timeless company. My fingers can't release the watch. My legs won't carry me to the door. All I can do is sit here as they approach, their fog forms solidifying with each step, their hands, so cold, so impossibly cold, reaching for me, for my pocket, for whatever essential part of humanity the watch needs to consume. This will be found after I'm gone. Perhaps they'll say I died of heart failure, like all the others. Perhaps they'll note the torn pocket, the missing watch, the lingering smell of metal in the air. Perhaps some young deputy will stand in this room and feel what I felt at the Mercer House all those years ago, that sense of wrongness, of boundaries thinned to the point of breaking. To that deputy I say this: run. Run while you still can. Because the fog is patient, the watch is hungry, and time, true time, not what we measure with our clocks and calendars. Time is something far stranger and more terrible than we can possibly comprehend. They're here now. Their touch is like ice against my skin. The watch is opening wider, impossibly wider, revealing its true nature at last. I hear the ticking. Not from the watch. From inside me. 3:42. The mist crawls through Blackwood County like a living thing. That's what I noticed first about the Delaney case. How the fog seemed to cling to everything the night it began, coating the pines and settling into the valleys like it was searching for something. 27 years on the force, and I'd never seen a mist move against the wind like that. I was drinking coffee in my office when the call came. Late October, just past midnight. The kind of autumn cold that seeps into your bones and stays there until spring. The station was quiet except for the hum of the ancient heater and the occasional crackle of the radio. My deputy had gone home hours ago, leaving me with paperwork and that strange, uneasy feeling that sometimes settles over our town when the moon hangs swollen and yellow in the sky. Marjorie, our night dispatcher for nearly 30 years, didn't waste words when the call came through. "Sheriff, got a report from the Delaney place out on Timber Road. Martha says her husband hasn't come home. Gone since yesterday morning." I sighed, setting down my mug on a case file. The ceramic made a dull thud against the manila folder. Charles Delaney was likely sleeping off a bender at his brother's cabin or had decided to extend his hunting trip without telling Martha. It wouldn't be the first time. "Tell her I'll head out there now," I said, already reaching for my jacket. The worn leather creaked as I slid it on, the weight of my badge pulling at the breast pocket. Outside, the station windows had fogged over completely, obscuring the empty main street of our town. I took Route 16, out toward Timber Road, my headlights barely penetrating the dense mist. The cruiser's tires crunched over fallen leaves that had frozen to the asphalt, making a sound like brittle bones breaking. The radio played static more than music, frequencies from distant towns bleeding in and out. Words and melodies too faint to recognize, yet somehow unsettling. The Delaney place sat at the end of a long dirt road, backed up against white pine forest. Their house was one of those old farmhouses, the kind built in the 1890s when people still worried about things like root cellars and storm shelters. The paint had faded to a sickly gray, and the porch sagged in the middle like an old spine. A single yellow bulb illuminated the front door, its light diffused by the mist into a sallow halo. Martha met me at the door before I could knock. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. Martha wasn't the type to waste tears. "He went to check the property line," she said without preamble. "The one that borders the old Stillwater land. Said he thought someone was trespassing. That was yesterday morning." I nodded, removing my hat. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke and something else, something acrid that caught in the back of my throat. "Charles take his phone?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The man was notorious for leaving it behind. "No. It's on the kitchen counter, dead. Hasn't charged it in days." Martha's voice was flat, but her hands trembled slightly as she led me through the house. "What about his truck?" "Still in the barn. He walked out. Said it wasn't far." I frowned at this. The Delaney property stretched nearly 80 acres, most of it thick woodland. The Stillwater border was at least 2 miles from the house, across rough terrain. "Mind if I take a look at his things? See what he might have taken with him?" Martha nodded, leading me upstairs to their bedroom. Charles's closet was open, flannel shirts hanging in a neat row. His hunting rifle was missing, as was his canvas jacket. Boots gone too. "He take his compass? Flashlight?" "Both gone," Martha confirmed. "And his old thermos. Charles doesn't go into those woods unprepared, Sheriff. Something's wrong." I nodded slowly. "I'll need to see where he was headed." Martha's face tightened. "Tonight? In this fog? Just to the edge of your property. I want to see his last known direction." She stared at me for a long moment, then walked to the bedside table and pulled out an old map of their land. Her finger traced a line along the eastern edge. "He was going here. There's an old stone marker at the corner of our property." I studied the map, committing it to memory. "I'll be back before dawn," I promised. "Lock your doors behind me." Outside, the mist had thickened to the point where I could barely see the barn from the porch. The temperature had dropped further, crystallizing the moisture in the air until it felt like breathing through frost. I retrieved my heavy-duty flashlight from the cruiser and checked my service weapon out of habit. The weight of it against my hip was reassuring as I started toward the tree line. The Delaney property began with cleared pasture land that gradually gave way to forest. My boots sank into the damp earth, leaving clear impressions behind me. The beam of my flashlight carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating suspended droplets of moisture that glittered like glass beads. The smell of wet leaves and pine sap filled my nostrils, along with something else, something mineral and old, like wet stone long buried beneath the earth. I found Charles's boot prints easily enough, preserved in the soft ground. They headed straight for the woods, just as Martha had said. The man knew these lands well, had grown up hunting them with his father. He wouldn't have gotten lost under normal circumstances. The forest closed around me like a mouth. Pine trees stood like sentinels, their lowest branches hanging just above head height. The ground beneath them was carpeted with needles that muffled my footsteps. Only the occasional snap of a twig betrayed my presence. Above, what little moonlight managed to penetrate the mist was diffused into a ghostly glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I followed Charles's trail for nearly 40 minutes, marking my path with strips of bright orange surveyor's tape tied to branches. The tracks led deeper into the forest than I had anticipated, veering slightly north of where the property line should be. Either Charles had gotten turned around, or he'd been following something. That's when I first heard it, a sound like distant wind chimes, barely audible over the soft whisper of pine needles overhead. I stopped, turning slowly to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to shift with me, always just behind my ear. The tracks led to a small clearing I didn't recognize from the map. In its center stood an ancient oak tree, massive and gnarled, its bare branches twisting toward the sky like arthritic fingers. What caught my attention, however, was the dark opening at its base, a hollow large enough for a man to crawl through, leading down into the earth beneath the tree's roots. Charles's boot prints led directly to this opening, then vanished. The air around the hollow was different, colder, but somehow dense. It pressed against my skin like a physical presence. When I directed my flashlight beam into the opening, the light seemed to bend and waver, as if passing through water. "Charles?" I called, my voice sounding muffled even to my own ears. "Charles Delaney?" No response came from the hollow, but the sound of wind chimes grew marginally louder. I approached cautiously, every instinct honed through decades of police work screaming at me to retreat. The ground around the tree was bare. No vegetation, no fallen leaves, just hard-packed dirt that felt unnaturally smooth beneath my boots. I knelt beside the opening, shining my light inside. The hollow extended downward at a gentle slope, widening as it went. The walls were lined with twisted roots that glistened with moisture, and the earth had been worn smooth, as if by the passage of many bodies over time. My light couldn't penetrate more than about 15 feet before the darkness swallowed it completely. Something glinted at the edge of the hollow, a small metal object partially buried in the dirt. I reached down and carefully extracted it. Charles Delaney's pocket knife. I recognized the worn wooden handle with his initials carved into it. The blade was extended and flecked with what looked like rust, but the metallic smell that rose from it told me it was blood. I stood quickly, backing away from the hollow. The chiming sound had stopped, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. Not even the rustle of leaves or the call of night birds broke the stillness. Just my own breathing, harsh and too loud in my ears. That's when I noticed the mist behaving strangely. While it hung motionless among the trees surrounding the clearing, around the hollow it swirled in a slow, deliberate pattern, like water circling a drain. And within those currents, I could almost make out shapes, suggestions of forms that would coalesce for an instant before dissolving back into vapor. I've faced down armed men without flinching. I've walked into burning buildings and stood at the edge of flood waters to pull people to safety. But something about that hollow and its whispering mist turned my blood to ice. I marked the location on my GPS and backed away, keeping my eyes on the tree until I reached the edge of the clearing. Only then did I turn and make my way quickly back toward the Delaney house, the knife secure in an evidence bag in my pocket. Dawn was breaking by the time I reached Martha's porch, the first pale light of morning diffusing through the lingering mist. I told her I'd found signs that Charles had gone deep into the woods, but I omitted mention of the hollow. Something held me back. Perhaps the knowledge that what I'd found defied easy explanation, or perhaps the look in Martha's eyes, desperate for answers I couldn't provide. I promised to return with the search team once the fog lifted, and drove back to the station with the radio off, listening only to the rhythm of my wipers pushing aside the morning condensation. The search team assembled by noon, volunteers from town, a couple of deputies from the neighboring county, and a search and rescue dog handler I'd worked with before. The fog had finally lifted, replaced by a thin, cold drizzle that soaked through clothing and made the forest floor treacherous. I led them back along my marked path, expecting to find the clearing with the hollow oak without trouble. But after 3 hours of searching, it became clear that something was wrong. The surveyor's tape I'd left was still in place, leading us deep into the woods, but the clearing itself was gone. Where I was certain the ancient oak had stood, we found only densely packed pine trees, their trunks straight and unremarkable, the ground beneath them carpeted with years of fallen needles. No sign of disturbed earth, no hollow, no bare patch of ground. The dog handler gave me an odd look when I insisted on searching the area again. "You sure this is the place, Sheriff?" I showed him my GPS coordinates, pointed to the orange tape tied to the last tree before where the clearing should have been. It was right here. A massive oak tree with a hollow at its base. He just shook his head. No oak trees in this part of the forest, far as I can tell. And certainly nothing big enough to have a hollow you could crawl into. The search continued until dusk, covering the entire eastern border of the Delaney property, and extending well into what had once been Stillwater land, now owned by a timber company based 3 states away. We found no trace of Charles, no sign of the clearing or the hollow oak. But we did find something else, something that sent a chill down my spine despite the rational explanations the others quickly provided. At 7 different points throughout the search area, we discovered perfect circles where the forest floor had been cleared of pine needles and vegetation, the dirt packed smooth and hard. Each circle approximately 6 feet in diameter. Each one with a small item at its center, a button, a coin, a tooth, a watch with its hands frozen at 3:17. "Probably just kids," my deputy suggested. "Playing some kind of game." I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Kids from town didn't venture this deep into the woods, especially not in late October when the days grew short and the mist rolled in early. As we prepared to suspend the search for the night, I pulled the evidence bag containing Charles's knife from my pocket, intending to show it to Martha. It was empty. The sealed bag remained intact, no tears or openings, but the knife was gone. Weeks passed. The search for Charles Delaney continued sporadically, but as winter tightened its grip on Blackwood County, the efforts grew less frequent and less hopeful. Martha's face grew gaunt, her eyes sunk into dark hollows. She refused to leave the farmhouse, saying only that she needed to be there when Charles returned. I visited her regularly, bringing groceries and news, though there was never anything significant to report. On one such visit, in early December when the first real snow had fallen, I noticed something odd about the house. The walls seemed to glisten in places, as if moisture was seeping through the old plaster. "Roof leaking?" I asked, gesturing to the damp patches. Martha shook her head. "It's been doing that for weeks now. Starts at sundown, dries up by morning. Plumber can't figure it out. Says there's no pipes in those walls." I touched one of the patches. The wallpaper was cool and slick beneath my fingers, but what struck me was the smell, that same mineral scent I'd detected in the forest, like wet stone long buried. "Martha," I said carefully, "has anything unusual been happening since Charles disappeared?" She stared at me for a long moment, then led me upstairs to their bedroom. The walls here were worse, the wallpaper bubbling with moisture that collected and ran down in slow rivulets. But it was what she showed me next that turned my blood cold. Opening the closet door, Martha revealed Charles's clothes, his flannel shirts, his old jeans, his Sunday suit. All of them dripping wet, water pooling on the closet floor. "Every night," she whispered. "I dry them out during the day, but by midnight they're soaked through again. And sometimes—" She hesitated, then reached into the pocket of one of the shirts and withdrew a small, smooth stone, polished black and gleaming. "These appear in his pockets. A new one every few days." I took the stone from her. It was heavier than it looked, and so cold it nearly burned my fingers. When I held it up to the light, I could see faint lines running through it, like script in a language I couldn't read. "Have you found anything else?" I asked, my mouth dry. Martha nodded slowly and walked to the bedside table. From the drawer, she produced a small wooden box. Inside, arranged in a perfect circle, were 11 black stones identical to the one I held. "This will be the 12th," she said quietly. "I think when there are 13, he'll come back." I left Martha's house that night with a sense of dread that no rational thought could dispel. I drove home through swirling snow, the headlights of my cruiser illuminating the fat flakes in hypnotic patterns. The radio played only static, occasionally broken by what sounded like distant chimes. That night, I dreamed of the hollow oak. In my dream, I crawled into the opening, following a narrow tunnel that spiraled downward. The walls pulsed gently, like the inside of a throat, and the air grew warmer and wetter as I descended. At the bottom, I emerged into a vast cavern filled with still, black water. Floating on that midnight pool were hundreds of perfect circles of light, each one containing a scene like a window into another place. And in one of those circles, I saw Charles Delaney. He stood in his own kitchen, watching Martha sleep at the table, her head resting on her arms. His form was blurred, as if viewed through flowing water, but his eyes were clear and fixed on his wife with an expression of infinite longing. I woke gasping, the sheets tangled around my legs and soaked with sweat. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. Outside my window, the snow had stopped, and a yellow moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across my yard. In one of those shadows, just at the edge of the tree line, I thought I saw a figure watching my house. When I blinked, it was gone. The next morning, I received a call from Martha's neighbor. He'd gone to check on her after noticing her lights had been on all night, and found the front door standing open, snow drifting into the entryway. Martha was gone. I drove out to the Delaney place immediately, dread sitting like a stone in my stomach. The house stood silent under a blanket of fresh snow, no footprints leading away from the porch. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed. Martha's coffee cup sat half full on the kitchen table. Her coat still hung by the door. I climbed the stairs slowly, already knowing what I would find. The bedroom walls were completely dry now, the wallpaper showing no signs of the moisture that had plagued it for weeks. Charles's clothes hung neatly in the closet, dry and arranged with careful precision. On the bedside table, the wooden box sat open. Inside, arranged in a perfect circle, were 13 black stones. As I stared at them, I noticed they weren't quite touching, each one separated from the next by precisely the same small distance. Except for 2 stones, which rested against each other, breaking the pattern. I never found Martha Delaney. Or Charles. The case remains open, one of many unsolved disappearances in Blackwood County's history. Most folks around here have their theories. That the couple ran off together, staging the disappearance to escape debts or start fresh somewhere new. Or that Charles met with foul play in those woods, and Martha, in her grief, took her own life. I let them believe what brings them comfort. I never told anyone about the hollow oak that vanished, or the circles in the forest, or the 13 stones I locked away in the evidence room that disappeared one by one over 13 nights. But sometimes, in late October when the mist rolls in and clings to the pines, I drive out past the Delaney place, now fallen to ruin. I park my cruiser at the edge of the property, and walk into those woods as dusk settles. And sometimes, if the conditions are just right, if the moon hangs yellow and swollen in the sky, and the air carries that mineral scent of wet stone, I can hear the distant sound of wind chimes. And once, only once, I found a clearing I'd never seen before, with an ancient oak at its center. Beneath it, a hollow large enough for a person to crawl through. From its depths came the soft murmur of voices that sounded almost like Martha and Charles, speaking gentle words to each other in the darkness. I didn't enter the hollow. Some doors aren't meant to be opened twice. But I did leave something there. At the edge of the opening, a small flashlight switched on, its beams swallowed by the darkness beyond. In the morning, it was gone, and in its place lay a smooth black stone, heavier than it should be, with faint lines running through it like writing in a language I'll never understand. I keep it with me now, in my pocket. On cold nights, it warms to the touch. And sometimes, when I hold it tight in my palm as I'm falling asleep, I dream of still, black water, and perfect circles of light, and the faces of all the missing, not afraid, not in pain, but watching, waiting, in a place just beyond the reach of this world. I've been sheriff of Blackwood County for 34 years now. Retirement's coming soon. The younger deputies joke that I'll need to be carried out of this office. They don't understand that some burdens can't be set down, some watches can't be ended. Not when you've glimpsed what waits in the hollow dark, not when you carry its token in your pocket. So I stay. I watch the mist in autumn, listen for the sound of chimes on the wind. And when hikers go missing in white pine forest, I lead the search parties myself, making sure we're safely out of the woods before nightfall. Because I know what happens in those trees after dark, when the boundaries between here and elsewhere grow thin. I know about the circles in the dirt, the hollow places beneath ancient roots. And I know that sometimes, if you listen closely in the silence between heartbeats, you can hear the voices of those who've gone through to the other side, calling names that sound almost like your own.